you don't know me, I'm the archivist with Govanhill Baths, and I've been coordinating the 20th anniversary of the occupation, all the events throughout the year, which are kind of culminate in this 2-day conference. We had a great day yesterday, lots of really good contributions, healthy disdain of bosses and union officials and all sorts of other people trying to control our lives. There's a few changes today. Unfortunately, Alan Tuckman can't come along, but we're really delighted to have John Cooper Senior and John Cooper Junior, who have been anarchist activists in Glasgow for 30 years, 40 years. And they're going to talk about occupations at Waterhouse, sheriff offices in Glasgow, during the poll tax, and Netherton primary. So I'll just pass you right on to John.
Well, hi folks. Nice to be here. It's a nice building, I notice, you know. If anybody fancies occupying at the end of this conference, it might be an idea. I've picked out 3 examples of occupations that myself, sometimes John, and a cast of thousands have been involved in over the past years. Before I actually start to explain the occupations themselves, I think it's important to point out that occupations are only one of the tools that we have in our toolbox. There's all sorts of strategies that we can use and develop. And also don't forget, the bigger fight is capitalism. So the occupation should be seen as part of that overall fight, in my opinion. So the 3 instances that I would like to talk about is the miners' strike in 1984 and the poll tax in 1989 to 1992, and also an occupation of a primary school in Castlemilk in the early 90s. So it's quite a lot to cover, but I'll do my best to kind of rattle through it. As a lot of people here will remember, Thatcher took on the unions in 1984, and she picked one of the biggest unions and one of the toughest nuts to crack, the miners' union. Unfortunately, and I've heard this on numerous occasions and numerous talks by miners, they were let down by the rest of the trade union movement, generally speaking. And so Thatcher had tried to, her strategy was if she could beat the miners, she could beat the whole trade union movement, or at least neuter it to a great extent. So I was involved in a miners' support group in Castlemilk where I lived, but I was also involved in the Glasgow area generally with the Glasgow anarchist group at the time. And in the miners' support group, one of the things that we did was to help to raise money for the miners. And initially we tried to do this in the orthodox way. We'd went to the Trades Council, who were dishing out collection cans for people that wanted to help with this. But once they found out that some of us were anarchists, they actually refused to give us the cans. So, not to be deterred by that, we just bought a stack of buckets and went out anyway in the streets and collected money for the miners. Very shortly, a number of us got arrested. It turns out that the Trades Council had put the cops on us for illegally collecting money. And over the period of the early days of the strike, 30 of the anarchists were arrested. But the minute they got out of the police station, they just went back to collecting money again, you know. And we had identified a couple of mining villages that we were going to personally deliver the money to. And when we took the money down to, was it Cumnock, John? A wee place, Cumnock, we were told by the union officials that they were very grateful that we'd done this, but they'd been told by the Trades Council not to accept any money collected by us, right? And surprise, surprise, about a month later we get a phone call, have you still got that money? Because the bureaucracy hadn't managed to get funds to them quickly enough. Also during that period, the Tories decided to sequester the funds of the South Wales miners and couldn't, not just their ordinary funds, but what was called the hardship fund, that was basically for the kids and the starving miners that had been collected. And in Glasgow we were so angry at this, we decided to occupy the offices of Waterhouse in Sauchiehall Street in the 16th floor, a whole tower full of various offices. So we planned it pretty meticulously. 12 of us were involved in the actual occupation, but 3 times that amount of people were involved outside, notifying the press, distributing leaflets, turning up in the day. What you've got to remember, of course, is all this is pre-internet. You know, everything was done through word of mouth and on the landlines and stuff like that. And of course there was no mobile phones and mobile cameras at the time, so there's no a great deal of kind of visual evidence here, you know. But as I say, 12 of us had checked out this office building for about a week. We'd cased the joint, so to speak. We found out when the commissionaires, the security guys, were at the doors, and when one of them went for the papers in the morning, leaving the door open, you know. So we had timed it so that we made a point of getting there right in time to get in there before the guy came back at the newsagents. In fact, we chained him into the newsagent, chained the door handle of the newsagent to keep him in there. But there was still another 2 commissionaires there. But we managed to get the keys without any bother. Previously, some of our guys had went in and measured the lifts, and they checked the speed of the lifts and everything. So we took in a whole lot of equipment with us. There's a wee account here with one of the members of the group at the time called The Day We Took the White Tower, a few humorous account of this. And we took lots of equipment in, including steel plates, bigger than the doors, and we bolted ourselves in with the steel plates. And at the end of the day, we were able to phone for the offices. They had to evacuate the whole building, not just that suite of offices. So they evacuated the whole building. Nowadays, it might be a bit more dodgy to do that kind of thing. You'd probably get shot, you know, they'd have an armed response team or something, you know. But in the days, they certainly didn't know who we were at first, and that's why they'd evacuated the whole building. But the account of that can be seen actually. We've got an archive in the Vixel Library called The Spirit of Revolt, and the full account of that can be seen in that. I think it'd be better to move on to the next item, which was during the poll tax. And before I actually say something about that, if I could just show you just to refresh everybody's memories, just a wee clip of the Times.
Central Regional Police and poll tax protesters clash as Strathclyde sale is halted.
Human roadblocks in the Highlands try to stop nuclear waste reaching Dunray.
The Orkney Inquiry hears how social workers feared a secret sign language would hide evidence of sex abuse.
Hello, good evening. Also on the programme tonight, the fishing nets that killed dolphins and the high-tech scheme to save their lives. And meet Cecil the blind snail, missing since 1858.
More than 100 anti-poll tax demonstrators have succeeded in halting Strathclyde's first warrant sale for non-payment of the tax. The sale was called off at the last moment because of fears of violence and the possibility of injuries. But the furniture of the Port Glasgow couple involved is still in the hands of sheriff officers, and many yet to be sold to recover part of the debt. Ken Bryson reports.
Protesters from throughout central Scotland marched on the former police station building in Glasgow where the sale was due to take place. The gates to the courtyard were locked and under police guard, but within minutes they were stormed. By then the protesters were unstoppable. They laid siege to a hired van packed with the family's furniture. Inside the vehicle were sheriff officers who were clearly terrified at the prospect of being attacked. It took the police more than 20 minutes to restore order, but only after the van had been vandalised. Time after time, the police tried to reconstruct barriers to keep the protesters from interfering with the sale. A legal attempt had been made to stop the demonstration. It named Tommy Sheridan, the chairman of the Strathclyde Anti-Poll Tax Federation, but he showed his contempt for the interim interdict.
It's ridiculous to stop me and every single one of you. Stop me here today.
The poll tax, he said, was barbaric, and so too was the region's method of trying to recover unpaid poll tax bills. As the tension mounted, Sheridan appealed to the police not to encourage confrontation, but he warned the protesters would not leave until the sale was called off. On the sidelines were council officials reporting directly by mobile telephone to their superiors. Then, with just 6 minutes to go to the 11 o'clock sale deadline, came the announcement which ended the confrontation.
The warrant sale is cancelled.
I'm sure a lot of people remember the times, but that was for the benefit maybe some of the younger people here. But there was a lot of real organisation involved on these things. I say this was pre-mobile phones, so in order to achieve stopping warrant sales and stopping the indents and prevent the sheriff's officers and into people's houses, we had to organise phone trees, and we had to be able to respond at any time, starting from about 6 in the morning, maybe getting down to places like Port Glasgow and so on, you know. So it was a very well organised campaign, I think, the whole thing. Some of the other occupations that took part during that, but we often occupied sheriff's offices themselves, just to teach them a lesson, you know, rather than just sit back and allow them to come into people's homes and try to intimidate and invade people's houses. We decided to pay them visits on a lot of occasions. Eventually they get really wise to this, and they had various security measures put in. You know, you had to ring in order to get into the offices. When you did get in, there was only a kind of lobby area that you could get into first. But we always found that when we got to the offices to invade it, that surprisingly a few minutes before the door had been burst open. I mean, it wasn't us obviously, because you're not allowed to break and enter, but as I say, when we turned up, the doors were open, so we were able to get in really without any problem, you know. And on one occasion I remember, it was very humorous, some of the Pollock Young team were there at the time, and we'd get up into the lobby of the sheriff's offices, but they specially reinforced cages, I suppose you could say. They were all behind this reinforced wall, and they were very happy about this, that we couldn't get anywhere near them. Not that we wanted to harm them, but they were very happy that we couldn't get anywhere near them. And then one of the boys realised that they looked up above them and saw that they had a lowered ceiling, and it was on these ceiling tiles. So the boys formed a human pyramid, and one of them scrambled up through the ceiling tiles and appeared at the other side of the fortified wall, and they just opened the door and let us all in, you know. So they weren't too happy with that kind of thing, but we did that on a regular basis. In one particular case, the cops got really heavy-handed, and we were really well secured in one of the offices at one point. The cops just battered their way in. They actually took away not just the door, but the whole door frame and stuff like that as well. And on that occasion we were all lifted, 30 odd people I think. And but that was the uncommon, you know. But again, there's a lot more information on that in the Spirit Revolt archive. The last thing I'll try and cover very quickly, if you don't mind, was a school occupation in the early 90s. In the 90s, Glasgow Council had decided, still under a Tory government, rather than try to fight the Tory cuts, they decided just to acquiesce, just go along with it. There was 21 schools up for closure, plus numerous daycare centres, adult housing complexes, community centres and other amenities. Glasgow's District Council actually just passed that they were going to close all these places. And I lived in Castlemilk at that point, and one of my sons had been to Netherton Primary School, so when we heard it was being closed, we went up to see what was going on, and some of the parents in the area had organised a small meeting at that point, and we went in and they were trying to work out what they could do about it. Initially, people try to do things in the traditional way and the kind of prescribed ways. So they thought, oh, we'll need to contact our councillors and get them to a meeting and get their support and so on. And that's what they did. Meantime, because a few years had already experienced this kind of thing with councillors and so on, before the public meeting, some of us had been into the city chambers and got information about the votes that had been taken to close the schools and all these other amenities. So when they called the public meeting, one of the local councillors for that particular area had turned up, and it was a very well attended meeting. I mean, there was a couple hundred people from the local area there. And the councillor got up and he gave his unswerving support for the campaign, and he promised he would do everything he could to help to save the school. And that was just the right time for us to produce the council minutes to show that he was one of the councillors that voted to close all these amenities. And not just him, but all the other Castlemilk councillors as well had voted to shut the schools. The people had said, what can we do about this? Because they wanted obviously to string him up, you know, at that meeting. But after that they had to think, well, how are we going to save the school? And we had a talk about that. And through past experience, I says to them, there's a number of things you can do, and talking about negotiating, writing letters and various things. I says, and there's also the possibility of occupying the place, you know, just take over. How can we do that, you know? And I said, well, it's actually your school, isn't it? You know, you own the place, the people in Glasgow own these places. It's our money that pays for all these things. And I said, but you've got to talk all these things over, work things out and see what the best idea is. And my wife and I went down that night, we just had our dinner, and this was like 2 hours later, we got a phone call, and it was one of the people for the group saying, "That's it, we're in." And I said, "What do you mean you're in?" He says, "We've taken over, we've occupied the school." And I thought that was, and this is something that I've noticed quite often. People, if you give them a wee bit of guidance to some extent and tell them possibilities, they'll take the initiative. They're not slow to take the initiative. It's people like trade union leaders and councillors and all these people that dampen things down. Ordinary people are keen to be involved and keen to effect change and keen to take direct action where necessary. But to cut a long story short, that occupation, I can't actually remember how long it lasted, but it lasted, I think it was something like 90 odd days. It was a long time. And the parents during that time got more and more sophisticated. It was a big learning curve for them. Most of them hadn't been involved at all before in any kind of political thing. So, and the thing is, I believe the role of activists is to try to help with things like that, but not to take over in any way. And it was basic things like they were how to conduct a meeting, because initially the first couple of meetings were really chaotic. There was people shouting at other people, you know, to shut up and things like that, you know. So it was just a wee bit of basic, you know, showing people how to just give people a bit of time to explain things and not to insult other people and stuff like that. And but obviously they understood that, and they learned that very quickly, and they developed an incredibly sophisticated campaign that involved a lot of people who got everybody on their side, and they actually, it resulted in them saving the school. And during that period of time, we were asked to visit other schools that were threatened with closure, and we went and we said, well, we're occupying the school and we advise you to do the same. And essentially the places that listened to that and occupied, they were the ones that were saved, they were the ones that didn't get closed. All the rest got closed. And in fact, one of the places we went to talk at was the Kinnan Park Centre, because the people there were wondering what to do, and they were considering the possibility of occupying. So we went there and we recommended that as a good course of action. So that's just if I had to really rattle through these, just 3 quick examples. But as I said, all these things are available online at the Spirit and Volt website. I've also got some bump there that I can give people about, you know, some of that stuff. I would just like to end by saying, as I said at the beginning, the problem here is the capitalist system, and occupations are only part of a challenge in that. It's a very important part, by all means, you know, but let's not forget that, you know. And I'll finish by saying, as a friend of mine used to say at one point, remember, take it easy, but take it. Okay?
That's great, John. Thanks very much. So we're delighted to have Dr. Andy Clark. He is not a professor, a doctor in oral history at Newcastle University, and his research was the first time that women's occupations in Scotland had been looked into.
Thanks so much, Paula. Hard act to follow, as ever. No, it's brilliant to be at this fantastic event, the 20th anniversary of the successful occupation. But I actually wish I wasn't here today, because we're supposed to be on strike, and due to the Tory anti-union rules, we missed the threshold. Newcastle University's turnout was 49.9%. So that's a bit of a bugger, but if they're going to make me work, I might as well do it at a fantastic event like this. Just take that away. I'll do it analogue. Over the last 6 or 7 years, I've been researching women's factory occupations during the early 1980s. Now, as Alan Turpin would have talked about if he was here, factory occupations are incredibly rare when workplaces are closed. It's very much the exception to the rule in how workers respond. And successful occupations that prevent closure are even rarer. And I would argue that Scotland's history of factory occupations in this period is fundamentally gendered. Because in the early 1980s, as Kenny Miller wrote about, not that Kenny Miller, the other Kenny Miller, wrote about the successful citizens that seem a particularly Scottish phenomenon. In the last year, there's been a successful one at Lee Jeans in Greenock, at the Lovable bra factory in Cumbernauld, and at Plessey capacitors in Bathgate. Now, these factories shared many similarities. They were branch plants of multinational corporations. But the most important similarity from my perspective is the vast majority of workers and the leaders of the workers, the shop stewards on the sites, were all women. So these are just some photos we can see here. There's the vote to continue the occupation at Lee Jeans, the demonstration in Bathgate, and a newspaper article that touched on what happened to Lovable. Now, the importance of these occupations for me is particularly during the period that it took place, 1981 and 1982. During that time, over 600 manufacturing sites closed in Scotland with a loss of over 120,000 jobs. But at these factories, closure wasn't something that was accepted, and redundancy payment wasn't discussed or bargained over. The workers seized control and barricaded themselves in the plant for varying lengths of time. And when we really think about this, most people in the room might be familiar with the kind of geography we're talking about. It's a relatively small geographical area between Greenock and Bathgate. And the fact that there's 3 occupations launched by women workers in such a short period of time in such a small area marks this period, I argue, as one of the most important and significant periods of working class activism in 20th century Scotland. And over the next 20 minutes or so, I'll try and convince you how I've arrived at that argument. And what was even more incredible is that all the occupations were successful. They weren't occupations that led to increased redundancy payments. They were successful in varying degrees, but the end result of every dispute was that the factories remained open in some capacity. Some of those who occupied remained in employment. And again, during this period under the first Thatcher government, further sticks them out as being incredibly important. Now, one of the things I've been thinking about recently, and this isn't a plug, it's a kind of anti-plug. I'm writing a book, I've just drafted a book on these 3 occupations that will be out next year. But if anyone wants it quicker, just drop me an email, so I've got the full draft if you want a copy of it. The only problem with that is that a copy editor hasn't seen it yet, so you'll need to deal with my really bad writing. But if you want it quickly, you can get it. But what I've been thinking about is, what do we think of? What is the historical story of deindustrialisation and class resistance in Scotland? And just by picking a few examples, if we look at deindustrialisation on film and TV, it's very much the story of male unemployment. The Full Monty, Bristow, Boys in the Black Stuff, Billy Elliot, etc. All the major TV and film stories of this period focus on male-dominated industries. And it's similar if we look at the ways in which Civic Scotland has tried to memorialise industry. Again, it's a story of work that men did, like the Endeavour statue in Port Glasgow, or the Hart Helm, or the steelworker in Shotts. The story of industrial Scotland is a story of male workers. And when we think about working class opposition to deindustrialisation and closure, it is once again the story of men, most prominently perhaps Jimmy Reid, who was not only the leader of the UCS working in 1971, but became a major celebrity in Scottish society, as you can see by the type of people who came to his funeral. So I would argue that the telling in academic popular discourses of deindustrialisation and working class activism in the period is the story of men. It's a masculine story, it's a narrative of male workers facing deindustrialisation. And this is both in the academic and the popular. I was quite shocked when I first started doing this research that not much had been done before because of that kind of significance that I ascribed to it. This was the first time that the occupations had been looked at collectively, and as far as I can tell, it was the first time anyone had done any research into the Lovable factory sitting. And that's despite this period of militant working class activism. So what I want to do over the next 15 minutes is just outline what happened at these three places in Greenock, Cumbernauld and Bathgate, and then return to that question at the end of how does a male-dominated history impact how we think about working class activism, but also how it impacts how those women involved think about what they did during the period. So I'm going to start with Greenock. Managed to get a nice picture when it wasn't raining. Greenock is the town that I was born in, and it's very much a kind of archetypal story of deindustrialisation in the west of Scotland. Greenock was historically the town of sugar and ships, and you can see that in this image here with the James Watt sugar sheds under the shadow of the cantilever crane. Throughout the 20th century, Greenock was dominated by three main sectors: sugar refinery, shipbuilding and textiles. But following the Second World War, the impacts of deindustrialisation had already begun to manifest themselves, and throughout the 1950s, Greenock gained a reputation as an unemployment black spot. And in order to combat that, in 1960, Inverclyde, which is the county that Inverclyde resides in, was designated as a development district with the recognition that without state financial support, unemployment would continue at unacceptably high levels. Many firms did very well out of this designation as a development district because the council could offer state support, subsidies and grants to companies to come in and open production sites in Greenock. The only problem with these grants was there was nothing to maintain the presence within the town. And one such firm that took advantage of that was the Vanity Fair Corporation, also known as VF, who are the multinational corporation who produce Lee jeans. They opened in the Larkfield Industrial Estate in 1990, and we received three years free renting rates, 3 years half renting rates, and 40% of the cost of the plant and machinery was paid for by the Scottish taxpayer. The factory was very productive, very successful, and Trading Charts reported that it was the most profitable and most productive of all of the jeans factories in Scotland and Northern Ireland. However, as we entered 1981, so as VF had the presence in Greenock for about 10 years, the shop steward at the factory, Helen Monaghan, entered into the annual wage negotiations with the employer. These were bog standard things that happened every year. There was no cause for concern at any point. But during these, she told me that she started to notice there was a reluctance by management to confirm or to commit to a wage increase. And she started to feel that they seemed increasingly reluctant to discuss their plans for the next 12 months. On January 31st, 1981, Helen's worst fears were confirmed, and it was announced that the factory would close and production would relocate to existing sites in Northern Ireland. This stunned the workers. This wasn't a factory that was struggling, this wasn't a factory that had no work, no orders on the floor. As Bridie Berlin told me, it was a paying factory. We knew it because the orders were there. They could see it themselves that work was available. So the argument of the firm that they were struggling didn't chime with the lived experiences of the women on the factory floor. So Helen, along with her full-time official from the National Union of Tailor and Garment Workers, put forward a series of proposals to maintain the factory in Greenock. They offered a range of different possibilities, the main aim of which were to maintain the factory and maintain the machinery in Greenock. So rather than me talk about it, I'll let Helen discuss it.
Why put these things in? Because you weren't going to give up, and obviously it was trying them, and job sharing offered everything, and every time, right, but we'll put that to them and then you get back, and the answer was no. So the very final thing, the I says, so we decided that we were going to occupy the factory. So they all got chairs and they put them in front of the door. They were to come in for the office. We barricade our cell in, and the minute I come in, no, we had Everton all planned. I says, the minute I come in and say, they said, no, Everton, that's us. So I come in and said, no, and the next thing we were barricaded in. We barricaded the office. We were barricaded in because maybe again, we didn't want them because we knew we wouldn't have, well, no, they would have just shut the place.
So decided after that meeting by majority vote that they would occupy the factory. Now this is something that was not taken lightly by the workers there, but they realised that with unemployment in Greenock 30% higher than across Scotland, and women's unemployment 50% higher than across Scotland, that they had little alternative but to fight for the jobs that they felt were rightfully theirs. Now there was no certain plan, as Helen says, it was just a kind of spur of the moment idea. When I came out of this meeting, we'll barricade ourselves in. So the first night of occupation is remembered as being kind of unorganised chaos, if you like. And there weren't any plans to organise because it wasn't felt that this would be a prolonged dispute. The whole aim of the first night was to give them a fright. As Cathy Robertson told me, she said, next day they'll come in, we'll negotiate and everyone will be hunky-dory, will not be a problem. And this led to, it's a kind of legendary story across Greenock of 3 female factory workers scaling down a skylight and going into the dark Greenock night looking for 240 fish suckers in order to try and feed themselves. But it quickly became apparent that the dispute was not going to be as short-lived as originally thought. Because even in the second day, when the press and the media came up, Helen didn't want to speak to them because she didn't want her face in newspapers for something that was going to be so short-lived. She didn't want to be seen as a troublemaker for what was only going to be a week at most. But once VF stated that they were refusing to negotiate and the factory would close as planned, the workers embedded themselves and laid the foundations for a prolonged campaign. There was a coordinated campaign. They travelled up and down Britain, they visited the local shipyards, they visited Upper Clyde, they visited the Linwood car factory, they visited working class cities like Sheffield, Liverpool, Manchester, London, to not only get solidarity and support from people, but to receive financial donations in order to keep the occupation going. Now, what was really interesting about Greenock itself is this became a community struggle, a town-wide struggle against unfair closure. Local businesses donated meat, groceries, vegetables to support the occupation so they could feed themselves. The bus that used to take them to the factory still ran and collected the women to take them to the occupation at little charge to the leadership itself. And there was also smaller gifts which came out in the oral history interviews and were really quite beautiful. Situations when you get in a taxi and the taxi driver asks, so what do you do? Oh, I work in Lee Jeans. Oh, you part of the sitting? Aye, and then at the end of the journey, the meter would be turned off and it would be okay, so there's no fare, that's my wee donation to try and support yous. And this came across in the interviews as hugely important for the workers that I spoke to, because it gave that morale boost and it gave some legitimacy to what they were doing. You know, as Margaret Brown said, it gave us a boost. We felt we're doing something right, people are supporting us, because there was too much industry starting to disappear then. So it was that sense of, I think the way Helen put it to me was if you were sitting in a factory and no one was visiting, no one was supporting you, you would seriously question if you were doing the right thing, but this type of support really legitimised the action we're taking. And it wasn't just that the factory became a site of pilgrimage for workers from across, particularly across Scotland, who wanted to visit to see what was happening and to offer support. And it became a cause célèbre throughout the labour movement, as people like Michael Foot and Tony Benn also visited to see what was happening and to offer any support that they could. So the question that I kind of posed to everyone I interviewed, they said, well, why did you do this? You know, what was the motivation? We can understand that yes, unemployment was high and other prospects were unlikely, but not many, as I said at the start, it's such a rare thing to do for workers to occupy a factory. And I think Tricia Arkley, who I interviewed, really put it better than I ever could.
I think it was the idea of them taking the work after us and getting it to Ireland very soon. Their factories were very feasible, rather than trying to make work. It's very feasible for them to invent themselves in work after us. These guys have lost their jobs, so why don't they take their job out? Take the job after me, give it to somebody else. No, you're not informed me. I'll start you off like my job.
After 7 months of occupation, there's so much more to talk about here, so again, if you want to read anything on it, just let me know. Because I've not even touched on the lack of support from the National Union of Tailor and Garment Workers, which is quite a key aspect of it as well. But just for the purposes of time, after 7 months of occupation, there was a management buyout, and there was a lot of kind of shadowy and cloaky deals going on. And it was revealed, although the figure was never announced, the manager bought it for substantially less than VF had originally valued it for. So if only he wasn't dead, it would be good to speak to him and ask what the kind of terms and conditions of that deal might have been. So in August 1981, the site was reopened under the new name of Inverware Limited, and the 240 workers employed went back to their machines. Now, Inverware would actually close only a few years later, so many people kind of look at this as a Pyrrhic victory, as a not a long-lasting victory. You try and tell that to the workers of Leigh Jeans. The fact that they took on a multinational company and defeated them means that for them this is a significant, major and important event in their lives and one they're proud of. But another really important impact of the successful sit-in at Leigh Jeans is what it then did to other workers who were going through similar processes at the same time. So just a few months after the Leigh Jeans workers returned to Inverware, the workers at the Lovable factory in Cumbernauld, Lovable is a bra manufacturer, were told that their jobs were closing, their factory would go, and they would also be made redundant. Now Cumbernauld, I know it's where you're from. For those who don't know, the beautiful concrete jungle of Cumbernauld, it was one of 5 new towns that were developed in post-war Scotland, as there was an attempt to kind of relocate industry and people from the overcrowded Glasgow city centre. And interestingly enough, it was never supposed to be in Cumbernauld. The best place for this new town was in Houston in Renfrewshire, but that was a marginal Conservative constituency, so the Tory government refused to start a new town there because you would have an influx of 50,000 Labour voters from Glasgow, which under normal political calculation does not bode well. So the land surrounding the Cumbernauld village was designated in, I think it was 1956, and the town planning began. And it was an incredible success story, Cumbernauld. It might seem hard to believe this now, no offence Paula, but it won a number of architectural awards for the innovative town centre that was built there. And over the 1960s, over 200 manufacturing firms established a presence in the town, and the population went from around 5,000 up to near 50,000. It was a vulnerable town though. Its economy was incredibly vulnerable because although there was a large presence of manufacturing, by 1979 I think it was, Alan you wrote this, you can tell me, 45% of Cumbernauld employment manufacturing was located in only 2 American firms. And in 1981, the early success of Cumbernauld manufacturing was first seriously challenged as unemployment began to increase and employment in manufacturing decreased sharply. Unemployment during 1981 increased by 21%. There were campaigns outside the local job centre, and the kind of campaign slogan became, "It's not a new town, it's a Baroo town." People were furious that they had been lured to Cumbernauld on the premise of a more prosperous future, but many of the structural issues had followed them from Glasgow, and unemployment continued to soar. And it was within this context that the workers at the second largest employer in Cumbernauld, the Lovable Bra Factory, were told that the future of their plant was uncertain. The very clever headline from the Cumbernauld News in October 1981 was that Lovable goes bust. It had been announced that the receivers had been brought in and the future of the plant was in doubt. Now, like Leigh Jeans and like so many of these factories at the time, there had been no prior warning, no indication that there were difficulties and problems facing the factory. And Fred Dixon said, the company never said anything to the union about any problems or any issues prior to the closure. Now, what makes Lovable interesting and certainly different from Greenock is it wasn't a case of the decision is made, your factory's closing, you're losing your work. The receiver came in to evaluate the situation and attempt to find a way out. So the workers didn't occupy immediately. The union took the decision to allow the receiver to continue to do his job, and they would continue to produce goods to try and find a way to secure the future of the factory. Just again in terms of the shock that this came to the workers with, Josephine King again puts it much better than me.
Well, we've been made for years and that, so they were doing well. They were really, really busy. I think we were shocked at it. when that happened to us. So I don't think, if I remember right, I don't think we were expecting it.
No.
And like me and I guess the majority of them, we'd always worked, we'd never not worked, and we couldn't believe that it was going to shut.
So the uncertainty over the future led to uncertainty over what kind of action the workers could take in opposition. And the receiver recommended initial rounds of redundancy to trim the workforce to try and make the plant more financially secure. And this was uncontested by the workers and the union. And in hindsight, I think a lot of people would recognise this was an error, because it began to accept the argument that there was an issue when, once the occupation began, that became contested. So as Irene and Steele told me, the factory tannoy told us all to go into the dining or the hall, and they kind of read out your name. And if your name, if you got, that was you. That was you. And again, over the next couple of months, the workforce went from 480 down to 200 as more rounds of redundancy were accepted and not contested by the workers or by the union. However, in January of 1982, the receiver announced what seemed to be good news, that a buyer had been found, a company called Baile UK. However, the workers were aware that this firm had bought other struggling manufacturing sites and essentially asset stripped them, sold them on, and made the workers redundant in any case. So it was actually the announcement that a buyer had been found that led to the sit-in at Lovable, as Betty Wallace still did.
And then we all got together and said, what we're going to do, she says, is we'll police the factory. We'll not let anyone do it, because we were frightened it was all going to go abroad and that would be really us out the factory. So we decided we'd police it.
Right.
So many of us all got together, and we went to the Labour Club and we were having discussions down there, you know, and we're saying, well, what will happen when the doors are open? We'll get in. Can you stay in it and maybe open the door for us? Well, that's going on, I'm telling you. So it ended up we got us all fixed out, and then it was sitting in the factory. I don't know how we get into it or not. I don't even know if there was an alarm set or what.
So unlike the Legions and unlike most factory occupations, the workers continued to work during the day and occupied the factory at night, because they felt that the management would come out and do a kind of cover of darkness, emptying of the factory. And also, once it was announced the factory was going to close, they did not continue their occupation. They left the factory and shifted to an external picket from outside, sitting in a caravan that had been supplied by anti-trade union company George Beattie and Sons, because his nephew worked in the factory, so no one told them, and they took it so that they didn't have to sit outside in the cold and the wind. And it wasn't strict, it wasn't highly organised, as Alice and Cairns told me, just everybody kind of put their name forward and who was willing to do it, you do this night and we'll do that night. So it wasn't what we would traditionally expect from a workplace occupation. It wasn't a highly organised form of action. However, the outcome was remarkably similar to what happened in Legions in March of 1982. After 6 weeks of the external picket, Lovable management bought the factory over and production resumed for Homeware Limited. And this ended what the Herald referred to as a most unpleasant bankruptcy and sit-in. And again, the workers returned to the factory, and Lovable had much more longevity and had a presence in Cumbernauld until the mid-1990s, and employment returned to pre-occupation levels. So just the last sit-in that I want to talk about before kind of offering some of my ongoing thoughts, where my kind of thinking is over these, is at Plessey capacitors in Bathgate. The Bathgate is another interesting example of deindustrialisation at this time, because it suffered greatly due to the decline of mining. Bathgate and West Lothian was mining areas since the Industrial Revolution. There hadn't been a great presence of manufacturing at all. So although there was a depressed situation throughout the 1950s, by 1960 Bathgate was facing undreamt of prosperity, which is what the Provost discussed as, due to the opening of a BMC, British Motor Corporation plant in the town in 1960. Bathgate was heralded as leading Scotland's second industrial revolution and would be the heart of the modern Scottish economy, shifting away from coal mining towards things like the production of cars and consumer goods. And another reason for this was the inward investment by the Plessey company, who took over an existing factory in 1963 and had plans to open new factories on the site, increase the workforce and diversify the production base. Now, what was interesting about Plessey and Bathgate more generally is that by 1981, so only 20 years after people were writing about leading the second industrial revolution, these plans had already been quashed to a large extent. There were problems at the BMC, which by that point was British Leyland plant, where they had a small occupation as well. And throughout the 1970s, the workforce at Plessey had been scaled back to such an extent that the factory was really just a shadow of what it had previously been. I think the numbers went from 2,400 workers to 330 over the 1970s. And what's really interesting about this is, given those levels of redundancy and downsizing, it might not be a surprise that the factory was then announced to close. But it was, because for those workers remaining there, they believed they had an illusion of permanence, that their jobs were secure, that the factory would never close completely. There would always be work at Plessey. So as Esther told me, we're all devastated at the final meeting, said it was closing, just couldn't believe that. Because it was such an important and such a dominant site in the town that the idea of it closing for good was not something that people could easily come to terms with. Now, there wasn't an immediate occupation when closure was announced. It was influenced by other events, and the most important one was the discovery of how Plessey had decided that the plant was unprofitable. Now, I've tried to say this a few times, but it confuses me every single time I do it, so I'm going to try. Plessey argued that the Bathgate factory was unprofitable and had to close, but in the figures that they used to justify that, they included the costs of making the workers redundant, clearing the site and getting rid of the land. So in the figures that justified closure because of unprofitability included the costs of clearing the site, which was being closed due to unprofitability, justified by those figures that included the clear-up costs. I think I got that just right. And when the workers discovered that, it fueled that similar anger that the Lee James workers had and the Lovable workers had, that their jobs weren't redundant. They were being made redundant. Plessey capacitor goods would still be produced elsewhere. A corporate decision had been taken that it would no longer be in Bathgate. So after a few weeks, the workers decided to occupy, and as Elizabeth kind of talks about it, it's another situation of confusion and kind of chaos.
So, how did the setting come? How did you remember the time leading up to it when you were setting?
In the setting, we didn't have a route, and it was under the minute then. Phone didn't know that smoking the water, and I was going in the road, you put it in, and that was it. The tape on that cheap paper, it was good because Tommy Bath, he's Stephen, he was showing the the supervisor and you see him standing at the gate and saying, what's happening? Do you get what I mean? Well, it was good. It was good there sitting. But then the next shift, another one.
And similar to what was talked about earlier, for the first time in Britain, the legitimacy of a workplace occupation was challenged in the courts, and Plessey sought interdicts for the occupying workers and took them to the High Court in Edinburgh. All workers were taken, and they were represented by, at that time, SNP left-wing activist and lawyer called Kenny McCaskill, who most of us will kind of know through his role in the Scottish Government in recent years. And he talked about the importance of trying to allay the fears of the workers of what County Court meant.
How important were the workers about the possible legal ramifications of what they were taking?
Anybody, people don't understand the law, so, obviously you will be arrested in Polish on your own, you'll be fined in prison on your own. So it was about allaying fears and balancing it with not saying law is the solution, getting that right, your job's quicker. There were the usual fears. It's the same with poll tax. If you don't pay, work, sale, spectre, go to jail,
So McCaskill and his colleagues in the law firm found a loophole in the most recent Trade Union Act that essentially designated that because this was in furtherance of a trade dispute, the occupation was legal and the workers could continue their dispute. This was huge news across the British Labour movement, as you might imagine. It was the front page of the Scotsman, the Herald, the Morning Star, and Tam Diel talked about how it should be making the boardrooms of London shake in their shoes because it had given the working class an important tool in their armoury. But not only did they have it, they now knew that it was legal and there was nothing to stop them doing it. Of course, the law was changed at the first opportunity thereafter, but for the Plessey workers, it was an important victory anyway. So after 6 weeks of occupation, a deal was agreed by the workers where 90 jobs would be maintained at the site for a period of 2 years. So it was a victory, and this is where we have to kind of think about the nuances. What do we mean about a successful industrial dispute? It was a victory because they prevented the full-scale closure of the factory. But all the women that I interviewed didn't discuss it in terms of victory or success. They talked about the jobs that had been lost rather than the jobs that had been maintained. And just think of Bathgate more generally, it's kind of synonymous with deindustrialisation in Scotland through the Proclaimers song Letter to America, when they talk about Bathgate no more, Linwood no more, and places like that. In an interview with Charlie Reid, they said there was 2 reasons they used Bathgate. The first one, the obvious one, it fitted with the tune and it fitted with the melody. But the second one was they remembered hearing stories about Leyland, about Plessey, and the impact that the closure had in the town, and for them it kind of synonymised the destruction caused by deindustrialisation in the period. So, just so I don't go over my time, I'm just going to, for a minute or 2 minutes, talk about some of the things. Why do I think this is such an important, significant period in Scottish labour history? Why are these important? Now, in a room like this, I'm sure lots of people would agree that these are important because it's working class people taking action in defence of their jobs and defeating multinational employers. So that's important in itself. But what else is interesting is, at the time, they were major events. At the time, they were widely reported in newspapers, on the TV. There were significant news items, which marks them as different because usually women's industrial disputes are not covered as extensively as those that involve male industrial workers. So they were important at the time, and so I would argue they're just as important, if not more important now. But what's happened over the last 40 years, since the period of these occupations, is there's been a process of marginalisation and forgetting and misremembering. Now, I know I'm asking an audience that is perhaps more knowledgeable about these things than anyone, than the kind of usual audience, but are there any occupations, had everyone here heard of those 3 before this event? You had. Hands up who had heard of all 3 of them. So an event like this, I would still say that is a small minority of people in the room. Now, why is that important? I would argue it's important because if we go back to the start, the story of deindustrialisation, the story of class resistance, is the story of masculine male workers readjusting to life post-closure. It's a story of fighting against Thatcher, but it's ultimately a story of defeat. It's a story of the working class being pushed back through the miners' strike, through the closure of the shipyards and things like that. There isn't a place for these occupations to live in our public discourse, in our memory of the 1980s. They don't fit the general narrative. They're not celebrated very often. They're not commemorated in statues. The funeral of the 2 shop stewards who have passed away weren't attended by the great and the good of Scottish society. And there are many reasons for that, but the most important thing for me is that it has happened and the process has underwent. So the argument that I've made in the book, which I say if you want a free copy that's unedited, give me a shout and I'll send it to you. The argument I've made is that if this exact same situation had happened, 3 successful occupations in central Scotland that opposed closure in a short period of time, if those had happened in the yards or the mines or steel making or any industry that was dominated by male workers, these would be well known about. They'd be commemorated, there'd be statues, and the leaders would be as famous as Jimmy Reid, Arthur Scargill and others. But because the narrative does not allow for the space of women workers to reflect so much, that's not been the case, and there's been an extensive process of self-marginalisation. And just to finish, to demonstrate that argument, when I interviewed the workers involved, there were 3 things that happened in the interview that were really surprising. First of all, they kept telling me they weren't important. They stressed, we didn't really do anything, we just occupied the factory, we weren't the important people. All we did was, illegally occupy our workers' premises kind of thing. They didn't have any sense or any claim to significance or gravitas. The second thing was that many had forgotten exactly what had happened, and they were very apologetic through the interview. I can't quite remember when, I can't quite remember who was involved, where it happened. And that's not a process that just happens through memory. Memory can only survive through the telling and retelling of stories. So it indicates that these are not stories talked about, asked about and discussed regularly. But the most startling thing for me, and I'm not going to bore you with memory theory because I don't even like it, I just use it. The most startling thing that came across to me is in 1982 these 3 disputes were talked about collectively. And there's tons of evidence in the archives that the workers spoke to each other. Of course they did. They would ring up the other factories for advice, for information. How did you do this? How did you do that? And we can see that, and we can see the record of it. And Helen Monaghan, the shop steward at Lee Jeans, she told the Morning Star the day after the Bathgate workers won their occupation that they did a dance in the canteen and celebrated that they had won the right to a sit-in. Fast forward to 2015 when I did the interviews, there is no memory of these workers of any other sit-ins taking place. I asked every single worker that was involved in it, do you remember anything else on this thing? And the only answer they could give was Upper Clyde in 1971, 10 years earlier. These links that existed at the time have not been reinforced and survived through memory. For these workers, what they did was an individual planned response rather than being a broader class struggle, because they're forgotten. Because, as I say, memory only survives the telling, the retelling of stories. And it was most interesting when I asked Helen Monaghan, who was quoted in the Morning Star talking about Bathgate, I said, did you do anything else after this? And she was adamant, no. Once we won our factory and kept our jobs, I just went back to my sewing machine. I wasn't interested, I didn't have time to become a full-time activist. I don't remember any other ones happening, and I wasn't involved. Fast forward 6 months after the interview, and I'm sitting in the archives in Bathgate, looking through photos of the Plessey occupation. And I come across this one. This is a demonstration of 2,000 people that was held in Bathgate in support of the Plessey workers' occupation. And at the front you've got the woman with the skirt on waving at the camera. That's Ina Scott, she's a shop steward at Bathgate. And right beside her, holding a bit of paper at the front of the parade, is Helen Monaghan, the shop steward at the Lee Jeans factory in Greenock. But over time, due to these disputes not being incorporated, not being remembered, not being memorialised, all memory of a broader class struggle between 1981 and 1982 has been forgotten. And what I see is events like this and other things we've been doing is to try and ensure that these almost forgotten sit-ins, this almost forgotten period of women's active militant opposition to job loss, redundancy and factory closure don't become completely forgotten. Thanks very much.
That was really good, Andy, thanks very much. We're just going to have a Q&A. We'll get John Senior and John Junior back up. That was amazing. We had hoped to have a couple of the women from Lee Jeans here, but unfortunately they were unable to attend. But I think Andy gave a really good representation. Does anybody have any questions?
Thanks. Really a question for both of the speakers, or one each if I can. You both mentioned lack of support from people who might be seen as higher up the pecking order in the union movement. One about the Trades Council in Glasgow not offering the support that the so-called anarchists wanted. And the other one about the trade union itself, trade union leadership, not supporting the workers in the dispute. So I'd like some indication of why you think that was and what's wrong with the trade union movement that allows something like that. Because I was a Trades Council secretary for a long time when I lived in Wigton Trades Council. I know it's not the biggest bit in Scotland, but we would never have dreamt of refusing support to the workers. I'm just wondering why that was. The other thing was a question about the three that you mentioned, Andy. They were all led in some shape or form by women. Is there something about women leading a protest or an occupation or whatever that's maybe better or more successful than men doing it, and you have any idea why?
Thanks very much. Both those questions for me are related in terms of the kind of composition of trade union power. Why was it that the women were more successful? It was because women weren't ingrained in how to be trade unionists. Now this builds on work by the late Peter Bain, who looked at women's activism during the Second World War. He made the argument that because they hadn't been bureaucratised in the same way, if you've worked in a place with a union member for a long time, there are particular ways of doing things that most of us go along with. There are particular ways of behaving, particular ways that folks are doing, and all the rest of it. And these three, particularly Jeans, which is the first, I think, the terminology of it, when they were told by their union that they should give up the occupation, when they were told by the full-time officer that I don't think this is going to work and you should maybe think about leaving it, it was just a case of, aye, thanks for that, fuck off. Because they didn't have that kind of, oh, you need to listen to your full-time officer, you need to take advice from your full-time officer. It was a case of, this is a dispute that started in the factory, led by a couple of shop stewards, and it wasn't going to be over until, as Helen told me, until they had lost support of the workers, they weren't going to go anywhere. So I think it is that your experience with trade unionism, and Peter's work in the Second World War was much the same. Union officials saying, you're not going to win this, you better go back to work, we can't support you. But when you've not been brought up or been in that kind of organisational situation for a while, you're more likely to reject that rather than listen to trade union officialdom, as Peter put it. So then that goes back to, that comes from the National Union of Tailor and Garment Workers, who were inherently a small C conservative trade union at the time. Liz Lester did work on a clothing strike in Leeds that shares a lot of similarities with what happened in Greenock in terms of lack of support. So the lack of support for Leigh Jeans came from, the argument they put forward was that they weren't sure if it was legal, so they couldn't offer official support until they sought legal advice. The great thing about doing a historical study is I went to their archives and found out they did get legal advice. They got legal advice quite early on that told them, much like Kenny McCaskill told the Plessey workers, due to a loophole in this law, this is a legal occupation, you should support them. But the National Union of Tailor and Garment Workers, they took 6 weeks to officially recognise the dispute, and then they withdrew that support before it came to a conclusion. And even when it was official, as I say, if I can give people more stuff to read, Helen talked about, she was summoned to London and basically told, you'll get out of that factory, we can't keep supporting you. So it was a really interesting dynamic that the union kind of claimed legal reasons, but that doesn't quite stand up to scrutiny. So it's interesting, from kind of my experience of trade unionism, I would say it's that the bureaucracy never had control. They never had full control of this. It was a grassroots movement that emerged from the shop shares movement in the factory, and they didn't like that they didn't have the control, so they didn't want to give it full support because they couldn't then control that support that they had. And then once they won, it's a kind of good way to end the story, once they won, the NUTGW came back and said, right, you're back working in a clothing factory, here's your membership forms, and they told them to beat it and signed up to TGW instead, because they had kind of stepped in and filled the void during the occupation. Sorry, I've rambled about that past years.
No, that's okay. Well, I would agree with everything that's been said there. And further to that, I worked for a period of my life in the car factory Roots at Linwood. And at that point in time, the trade union movement was very, very strong. And I think what's happened is what happened much to the Labour Party as well. They tended to take people for granted. And for example, during the poll tax, the Labour Party's attitude to the poll tax was, well, we don't like it, but you'll need to pay, or we will need to pay. We can't break the law, right? That's the same people who celebrate things like the 100th anniversary of the suffragette movement, who smashed windows, set buildings on fire, and all sorts of things. And of course, trade unionism would never have come to being if people had never broken the law. So the whole point is that you've got these trade union officials, in my opinion, largely and essentially careerists. And that's their main concern, maintaining their career, no worry in particular about workforces and so on. And I think there's numerous examples of strikes that have happened where the trade union were unofficial strikes and so on, where the trade union either don't back it at all or are very, very slow to back it. So unfortunately that's the situation, you know. I mean, on the one hand I would say I wouldn't apologise for my remarks about the trade union movement or certainly not the Labour Party. You know, I think they should apologise for how they've treated working class people. They've been taken completely for granted for decades.
Anyone else?
I just on the theme of the last two questions, I mean, what I found, I mean, I was in the print union, and I remember distinctly the campaign with the poll tax and going to a shop just being a Cloggan Galleries, and the platform, the people like Mick McGahey, one of the left wingers of the day saying, you show the troops and we'll lead. And it just never happened. And I think you also with all these occupations, they just shell on the workers. I mean, they would rank and file work out with Caterpillar, Lee Jeans, all these places. We were involved in my factory with weekly collections, solidarity. And I say at the end of the day, it was the hierarchy that let us down, especially the poll tax. We argued you can't break the law. If you couldn't break the law, wouldn't you be in there in the first place?
Anyone else? Shall we have?
Thanks. I mean, you mentioned Limerick. I mean, the tragedy is that when Lee Jeans happened, Limerick shut down. You can see if they had occupied, then it could have completely changed the whole situation. But I think in the question of occupations as a whole, we talked about ECS yesterday. The follow-on from that was, I think, 200 occupations throughout, most of which were successful. There was another one, a Plessey plant in Alexandria, which was very successful. Fast forward 10 years, the whole situation is different. Workers are on the defensive. Thatcher's putting the boot in, essentially up to the miners' strike, so that things like places in Lovable are very much the exception, whereas in the early 70s it was much more common.
Just very quickly. Well, just to reiterate, I mean, the Labour Party look at themselves and they think, why are we in this situation today? You know? Well, just what I said, they've taken people for granted for far too long, you know. And the trade union movement, how do you go from being a really strong institution? And by the way, I was a trade union member for most of my life, and even when I retired, I was a part of Unite Community. But after a number of years, I gave that up. I gave it my best shot, but again, I left that through despair, that they just weren't achieving anything. I tried to get my local branch of Unite to deal with the sanctioning that was going on with the DHSS, and I get stonewalled every time because they didn't want to criticise another trade union, the PCS, and how their workers were operating. So unless the Labour Party and the trade union movement gave themselves a real good shake and change their whole attitude towards things, what they don't seem to realise is this is a war that's going on. It's an actual war, it's a class war. And the way they behave isn't any way to deal with the situation. There's working class people literally dying because of the actions of governments, and the Labour Party have got no clue of how to tackle that. In fact, they're part of the problem, no part of the solution.
I'm committee member from Glasgow who's going to talk about post-war squatting. And we've got another guest who's just coming in today who's involved with still game for the Baile, which is an occupation that's current in Maryhill. So I'll pass you on to Joey first.
Thanks, Paula. So I'm going to go further back in the past than what the conference was supposed to cover, and then Norman's going to actually talk about something that's happening now, which I think is probably good. So just as a bit of background, at the start of this year, we started this Glasgow House and Struggle archive project to create a digital space and a kind of forum to record and share and learn from Glasgow's radical house and history. And yeah, over the past few months we've done a number of workshops to kind of develop that. So Paula, we did a kind of hands-on workshop on scanning and uploading materials, working with archives and resources. We had a workshop last week with the Mayday Rooms archive in London, kind of sharing their experience of documenting ongoing house and struggles. So yeah, that's just something to keep an eye out for, and hopefully, a lot of the history that's in here we can include in the archive over time. So I'm just going to go through one, that's a bit from the website. So I'm going to just talk briefly about this post-war squatters movement and housing occupations that took place in Glasgow and in London and right across Britain in the immediate post-war period. And I think Andy was talking about these struggles that have always disappeared from memory because they've not been shared. And I think the squatters movement for me is one of these. Like, I was surprised. I knew a lot about it in London, famous kind of Great Squat Sunday, Kensington Mansions. In Glasgow, hardly ever seen anything about it. And there was an article in this Journal of the Law Society of Scotland a few years ago called Unlocking Doors, Demystifying Scotland, and it has a brief reference in it. It's interesting. It says, because of the absence of any squatting movement in Scotland, there's a public perception that squatting here is illegal, and it contrasts the kind of English experience in the 70s to the kind of lack of this in Scotland. And in a way it kind of makes that link between this lack of maybe historical understanding has direct political consequences today. And it's quite interesting as well, just that has this reference to the 46 squatters movement, and it said it faded thanks to the government's willingness to rehouse the squatters. So I'm going to challenge that last line a bit because I don't think that's what happened. I'll just go through this quickly. Obviously the housing situation in Glasgow at the end of the Second World War was a complete human, social, and economic disaster. Soldiers coming back, again, no homes for heroes, echoing the experience of the First World War. Official reports had housing as the single greatest public health problem in the city. And I think just incredible overcrowding and concentration. So there was that statistic that 3 in 7 people in the whole of Scotland lived within 3 square miles of Glasgow city centre at the end of the Second World War, 700 people per acre. And these were slums in Western Europe, in a city that mainly, for the most part, escaped the bomb damage we've seen in England, obviously across Europe. And as well, you can see it continuing to this day, is that the level of the housing crisis in Glasgow was well beyond any other comparable city in Britain. So 100,000 people, 100,000 homes were declared needed, had about 90,000 families on Glasgow Corporation housing lists. Tens and tens of thousands of people homeless at a time. And just in comparison, for example, to other places in Glasgow, 1 or 2 room apartments, that was 40% of the housing stock. A quarter of the population living in more than 2 a room, and 50% without a bath. And the comparative statistics in Manchester was 0.5%, 2%, 3%. So it's kind of ongoing housing crisis in Glasgow that continues until this day, has deep, deep roots, and quite unique compared to any other cities in Scotland or in England. So I think one thing that the squatters movement maybe challenges is this idea of the kind of spirit of 45 and maybe some of the romanticised notions of what happened at the end of the Second World War. This idea that you just had the Labour government, for the first time, this commitment to mass council housing, and it kind of just happened from the top down, that Labour built these houses, the working class was grateful, and then at some point Thatcher destroyed that story. But it's all a bit of a myth to an extent. So by the end of 1946, only 3,000 houses had been built in Glasgow. compared to health and education, land, construction industry was never nationalised. And in response to that, in August 1946, this mass squatting movement kind of arose right across Britain, a direct action movement by homeless families, by ex-soldiers, to deal directly with the homelessness and to force the Labour government into action. So I think that's a key thing, is that, every point it's been through mass movements that has forced the state to act, and any gains have been won through mass struggle. At no point, even in this kind of height of the spirit of 45, was anything won without struggle from below. So, the first stage then was that in August 1946, these empty army camps were occupied right across Scotland very rapidly. So, with the support of Communist Party members, even members of the Labour Party, thousands of people moved into these abandoned camps. So, in this one day, in 16th of August, at all these sites occupied in organised movements, so Bearsden, Blackhill, Crookston, Darnley, Ditchman, Nitshill, Tory Glen, all these sites were systematically taken over and used to house homeless families. And a lot of these sites were occupied as housing for 5 to 10 years. Many of them were kind of absorbed into local authority housing. Some of them in Ditchman, Flittings went on for 20 years. The people were still living in these houses or camps. They were taken over in this one day. So, in terms of the tactics, which I think we're quite interested in today, stories like 30 men and women moving on this Darnley site. You had seizures kind of planned by Peter McIntyre, the Govan Tenants Association, moving from Govan into these sites. You had, this idea that for many children it was the first time they'd seen grass living in their lives. Kenneth Head was squatted. You had 50, 40 families moving in, taking over golf courses, and also immediately having to defend themselves from police and attempts at eviction. In Blantyre and Hamilton, there was barricades put up, in Auchenry Special School as well. And this even 500 miners coming out on strike, Plain Street Colliery, in support of these housing occupations. So I think, by the end of October, there was only 9 camps that remained unoccupied right across Scotland, 7,000 families living in them. And even the BBC talked about this strange new mood of orderly lawlessness, and the momentum that built up as soon as people actually seen that this direct action was taking place, that the sites could be defended, that you had this strange mass movement that emerged right across Britain. And that eventually forced the Labour government to act because of the movement from below, because of the occupations and the squatting that was taking place. And they were forced to allow the squatters to remain. And because of this, the squatters were exposing the failures or the limitations of state provision of housing, the promises that had been made. And in Glasgow, Charles Johnson notes, it's become firmly established in the consciousness of the working class. I don't know if people have seen this. The Warble story was directly linked to this. It's a very famous play that was written and performed by the Glasgow Unity Theatre, an explicitly socialist working class theatre group that had emerged at the end of the Second World War, and kind of, highlighting the plight of homelessness and overcrowding, although I've seen someone called it the Warble's Horror because they thought it was really cheesy, but anyway. This was kind of culture really being used in direct service of a mass movement, so the numbers are quite incredible for that. It's like 100,000 people had seen the Warble story, this play, within the first 6 months alone. It toured right across urban communities and mining communities across Scotland. And here a group of squatters were the guests at Glasgow Unity Theatre at one of their performances at the Queen's Theatre in town. When Peter McIntyre, one of the leaders, made a speech on behalf of Glasgow's homeless on this occasion, the Lord Provost and other dignitaries were apparently squirming in their seats, so quite a nice tactic there to embarrass those in power. So, just to go quickly, kind of the movement, they moved into the second stage where some of the contradictions started to intensify. So from these army camps, you then moved on to expropriation and occupation of empty private property. So in Glasgow, this included the premises at Glasgow Press Club, Warden's quarters at Barlinnie Prison, Big Rutland House on Govan Road, a 12-bedroom house in Paisley Road West, a 24-room mansion in Kelvindale House, and the Belgrove Hotel, which is obviously still there on the Gallagate today, and as well as the Grand Hotel in Charing Cross. So from these army camps, they were then directly challenging private property, and whether the Labour government would accept that the rights of people to decent housing would trump those of private property owners. And many of the squatters came from the worst housing, which is these sublet one-room apartments like in Warwick Street and Neptune Street in Govanhill. So again, just in terms of tactics, there's quite interesting things developed. So like, there was a way of booking in that squatters' families would chalk their names on the doors of the empty tenements. In many cases, defence committees were formed to defend the sites and also to collect basic money as was possible to cover rent, fuel and electricity charges. And you had the active support of a coalition of Communist Party members, the remnants of the ILP and the tenants associations which had emerged as well. And so it was a case of working class families forced to take direct action really to meet the absolute most basic needs. I mean, this is for people to live in empty, disused tenements without housing or lighting. And this was a quote from one of the squatters that we're all decent working folk, we're desperate for some place in which to live. 5 children, their ages ranging from 4 to 16. During my married life, I've only once had a sublet house. My name has been on the corporation waiting list for 11 years. So it's really important in terms of speeding up the process, the mass council house programme that did eventually take place in Glasgow. And it's really, this is the only photo I could find of the actual Glasgow squatters. So this is a family moving in, and the Herald saying the government was kind of fine with it until it grew, and the involvement of the Communist Party, especially in London, put the fear into them. But squatters fined at Falkirk were cheered by crowds outside the courthouse, and you can see that lassie smiling there. Good. So, the same time in London, the movement was really intensifying. So famously, there was a Great Squat Sunday where the Communist Party supported homeless families in requisitioning these mansion houses owned by Tory peers in Kensington. And at this point, Nye Bevan, an architect of welfare state, could see the contradictions or the limits reached. So he said he sympathised with the squatters, but he could not allow them to rule. So at this point, repression really stepped up. Communist Party leaders were arrested and charged with conspiracy. And in Glasgow, right from the start, the police had been in the service of the landlords and property owners throughout this period. So a huge number of evictions were carried out in August and September, like at the Belgrove Hotel and the Charing Cross, Grand Hotel at Charing Cross there. So barricades were often deployed, there was fighting with police, there was attempts at re-entry. And Peter McIntyre, one of the tenant leaders, said, "I think it would be a tragedy to have a social upheaval in Glasgow, but as matters stand, it may be necessary to resist police physically." At the same time, the tenants associations, the squatters, were organised. I knew that was going to happen, it's never not happened in any political meeting I've been in. So they met with George Buchanan, who had been one of this original Red Clydeside cohort of socialist MPs, was now Under Secretary of State for Scotland, and he completely rejected the squatters' demands, which themselves are quite interesting. So they were demanding to run the army camps on a non-profit basis until council housing was available. They also demanded that all large houses up for sale or unoccupied to be requisitioned and squatters allowed to remain. So these are still demands that are making themselves felt. You know, in the wake of Grenfell Tower disaster, you know, that was a demand that these empty properties be requisitioned for the families made homeless in the tragedy. So at this point, the Labour government ordered firm and positive action in defence of ordered government and the principles of social housing to local authorities. So again, it's quite interesting in terms of tactics that the government started to try to vilify the squatters by saying that they were jumping the queue, that they were kind of somehow cheating the allocation system, they were being unfair to other tenants. So these attempts at division are still ongoing today. And what was interesting in Scotland as compared to England was that they were able to use this Trespass Act, which had been implemented during the Highland clearances in the 18th century. You know, this law didn't exist in England, but from the clearances it existed in Scotland, and that's what was used to make it a criminal offence. So just to finish then, not to romanticise this, I mean it was a kind of desperate act in an extreme situation. And one squatter said that life is a fight not only against authority, dirt, cold, damp, heat, illness and rats, but against one's own growing apathy. Families begin to crack at different periods. On the faces of some there is a look of strain, controlled despair, such as soldiers show when they have seen too much action. At the camp committees they say quite plainly there is a limit to human endurance. They live near the edge of that limit, fearing that someday they will slip over. Charles Johnson, the historian, who really is the only one I can find who's written about this in Glasgow, he says that the key thing was that these people at the best they didn't slip over. And along with the tenants associations and other organisations in Glasgow, they played a key role in the housing struggles that emerged in the following years, and they won concrete victories in terms of like housing allocation for Glasgow the next year. And Johnson, explicitly links it, but by the presence of squatters meant that the case for the provision of council housing was made. So, but like John was saying, it wasn't the occupation itself, this was allied concretely to a demand for council housing to be built. And by highlighting the inadequacies of the housing situation, they appealed to these aspirations of a radicalised working class, and they also put pressure on the government to fulfil the promises they had made. And I'll just finish with this. He says, Scotland is sometimes portrayed as anarchistic and individualistic. However, the Scotland which took place in Britain, in Glasgow and other towns across Britain in the 40s and 50s was the antithesis of that. It was collectively based, organised from within the working class, and had a collective goal in mind. Public sector housing for all. And I think for us in Live and Rent and for the occupation that Norman is going to talk about, those demands are still very much there and allied to that tactic of occupation. So, I'm going to pass on now to Norman, who's going to link that to the present day. And just in terms of our approach to just a specific idea, we're going to try and do some further research to document the struggle, to try and create an interactive, or a map at least, of these sites, to build that history into the streets and areas and communities where we're organising today, to share some of those lessons and to try to re-establish the links. For me, for example, I never associated occupation or squatting as really part of the housing movement here. So those radical links do exist, and Norman is living them out today. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Norman Cunningham, and I'm here to talk about still game for the Valley. So just for those of you who are not familiar, the name comes from the fact that we are occupying a piece of land in Maryhill, which was formerly, it's still known as the Valley, but it's more significant for the fact that it was the shooting location for the TV programme, Still Game. In fact, all the houses are gone, as I'll explain as we go on, but the block of flats that Jack and Victor lived in is still there. Osprey House, as it was known, it's still there, but I think its days are numbered, as I'll explain. So, just to give you a wee bit of background, I'll show you first of all what used to be there. And this is Kalina Street, which is the main street that runs through this bit of land. Kalina Street, this is looking from Maryhill Road, just by Maryhill Locks on the canal, if anybody's familiar with that. I'll show you a map in a minute. So this is what it used to look like. It's actually up on a high point, it's the highest point around there. It's prime real estate. These are the houses that used to be there. They're all just pre-World War council housing type things. There were tenements. The whole area was covered and was built up with these tenements. But they decided Kalina Street was going to get demolished for various reasons, which they then refurbished the houses, the same houses at the bottom of the hill. And they still stand today. But these ones, they got rid of for whatever reason they came up with at the time. That's what it used to look like. And this is about the time when they were filming Still Game. This is prior to demolition. The demolition was carried out in 2007. So they cleared probably over 500 people out of these homes and slowly ran them down, boarded them up, and then the bulldozers moved in. So this is a wee map of where I'm talking about. So you've got the canal here, and on the other side is the River Kelvin with the Kelvin walkway. Just a stone's throw down here is the Botanic Gardens. And just here, running along here, is Maryhill Road. So this bit of land here, and because it's raised, which you don't get from this photograph, you've got views right out to the Campsie Hills and beyond. It's, as I said, prime real estate, West End. It's what they're trying to do is make this part of the West End by, as I'll explain as we go on. So that's the actual bit of land itself. It's 3.5 acres. It's not flat. It's challenging, if you like, in terms of any building that needs to go in there, but not impossible. So now these houses here, which are new builds, just here and here, these are Maryhill Housing Association. They're all mid-market rent, quite expensive. Some of them are shared equity ownership, so, you know, private houses by any other name. That's looking from the bit of land down. And they look quite attractive, these houses, these mid-market rent places. But they're actually now developing a lot of problems because they look nice, but they're throwing up cheap and cheerful. And then, you know, 10 years later, they're starting, well, even 10 years, 8 years, I think they've been up. They're starting to have problems with water ingress and draftiness and the usual stuff. So, I'll just go back. So what happened, a wee bit of the history, is that bit of land has been vacant since 2007. And it became a local amenity, if you like, for dog walkers, for kids to play on. And it just became part of the area. A sign went up in October last year that the land was for sale. Big billboard thing. And that was the first anybody had been told about it. That was the first we knew. And it was the first that actually came to people's consciousness that it was able to be sold. So, as it turns out, it's owned by Glasgow City Council. And we looked into it further and found that the prospectus that was put out, the marketing material, was for a private development of up to 350 houses. And they put it up for sale, for tender, basically. And the closing date of the sale was 21st or 20th of November. The sign went up in October. So a few of us who basically living rent members in the area put our heads together and we thought, well, this was previously social housing. It was a community. It was more than just houses. It was community. People, generations of people were brought up and grew up there, went to school there. Other neighbours, the community. It was a tough, tough place to live. But people, were brought together in that community. When it was demolished, those people were scattered to the four winds, with the promise that when the place was redeveloped for social housing, that they would be able to move back. Well, the same promise was made across the canal in a very similar scheme called the Butney, where people were moved out. What happened was there was over 500 people moved out of there. When it was redeveloped, there was 35 new social houses, and the rest were award-winning private houses right next to the River Kelvin walkway, private housing. So something like 300 social houses were demolished and replaced by 35 social houses. We saw the same thing about to happen here. And this time they were barefaced enough to actually state that it was for all private housing, no social housing. So we can't have this in terms of just lying back and accepting this. So we started a wee campaign of trying to talk to the council to find out, you know, what if there was any room for manoeuvre, if there was any room for them to consider social housing, etc. And we just stonewalled. We got absolutely nowhere. Long story short, we decided that the only thing we got out of that was they put off the date of the sale to the 15th of January, from 20th of November to the 15th of January. So we thought we could actually get something up and running in terms of a campaign, but over Christmas, New Year and COVID, lockdowns and all the rest of it, it was really, really hard work. But we did get a big Zoom meeting where we invited local politicians, the council, and we had over 70 people from the community participated in a Zoom meeting. And at that meeting, it was one of the better parts. At the meeting, at the end of the meeting, listening to all the double talk from the council and the politicians and blah, 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 I announced that we were going to occupy the land. And that was a great big bombshell. So on the 15th of January, which was the closing date, we occupied the land. There's three of us. So we had a gazebo thing, and it was freezing cold, the wind was howling, but we stood there, and we got our photos in the evening time. So that was the start of the occupation. So most of yesterday and today you've been hearing about occupations of the past. I'm here with the good news is that there is one happening right now. So what happened was, to replace the gazebo, this man here, Stevie Marshall, great man, there's a carpenter, the Chippy, offered to build us a bothy for shelter, because what we did, we got a rota going, so we had people going up there every day. My big idea was that we'd have another Pollock Free State, another Faz Lane peace camp, but in the middle of COVID, it wasn't happening. So Stevie built us a wee bothy. This is the construction. So you can see there in the background the camp trees and how high up. It's a really nice piece of land, highly desirable. So this is the construction of Bobby the Bothy. Bobby from the Still Game, of course. And eventually we ended up with our wee bothy, wee bit of shelter, keep us at the weather. And it became a wee landmark around there. It became a talking point as well for the community. A lot of people walk past there to get to the high flats. So we made a mark. This is us. But we took it a step further. Now this was a local group of G20. It's a local youth group up there, and one of the young boys there is a budding artist, and he came and painted the bothy for us. So this was in the winter last year. To get up onto the bit of land, it's elevated. I went flat on my ass walking down that path. So the first thing we've got to do here is build some steps. And this is some of our young volunteers putting in some steps. So we started improving the land a wee bit. It was more symbolic. It was saying to the council, we're here. And this is our land. This is, you think you own it. But what we were saying to them is, you're the guardians of this land on our behalf. You're the caretakers, and you're not doing a very good job of it if you're selling it up. So that was part of our statement. The other thing was, we had someone offered us a whole lot of a tree surgeon business, offered us a whole lot of wood chips. So there was a lot of paths on the land from people. What's the name for that? Where paths become, because people walk there. People walking their dogs, people taking shortcuts, all the rest of it. So we lined all the paths with wood chip. And that was appreciated by the local community. The next step was I didn't, but these young people decided to build a community garden. And that's what went on. That land itself was actually just rubble, with a wee bit of soil and clay put on top of it. Once you dug about a foot into it, it was just rubble from the demolition. So it was really, really hard work. And this is, so most of the people who have been working actively on this are university students from Glasgow Uni, who are all mostly living rent members as well. That's how they got to know about this action and got involved. So there's us with the bothy. And I think that's the end of it. So I could stand here all day showing photographs and talking about community gardens, but this isn't a gardening conference. So what I want to do is tell you from there where we got to, where it's up to today. So first of all, the good news is that the land is no longer up for sale. But who knows how long that will be. So that's a victory. The second part of the campaign was that we decided to, I looked into this community right to buy legislation. And after a lot of research, I thought we could do this. So the thrust of the campaign is to achieve the right to buy the land as a community. And we're in the process of doing that. Now, the legislation itself, which on the surface looks great, is actually designed around we rural communities, wee places, in the Highlands and places, maybe even the Isle of Egg being one of the biggest ones that people know about, and recently Langham down in the borders. But it's not designed for urban community buyouts. Occasional people would buy a church somewhere and convert it into a wee community centre and that sort of thing. If we achieve this, it will be the biggest urban community buyout in Scotland. Okay, so there's a lot at stake here. And excuse me if I get a wee bit emotional, but I've put a lot of my life into this. This is the first time that this has happened to me. Anyway, so in order to be considered for a community buyout, we had to form a community body. The first thing we looked at, there's three or four ways of being a recognised community body. We pursued being a charity, first of all, and we just kept getting stonewalled there as well. So we've now formed a community body, which is a company limited by guarantee. And we have a board, etc. So we've now been officially recognised as a community body. We're in the process now of putting forward our application. So if we're successful, what it means is that if the land comes up for sale again, we get the right of first refusal. So that will be a big, big step. The council were talking about getting 9 million quid for this bit of land. Well, I'm not even thinking about the money. If we get the right to buy it, we'll find the money. So, where we're up to now is that under the legislation, we've got to get 10% of the people on the electoral roll who live within that area to sign and agree that they support the buyout. We've estimated there's about 8,000 people live in that immediate area, so we've got to get 800 signatures, but that's if you're actually applying to buy it before it goes up for sale. Because it's been put up for sale, we have to get significantly, that's what the legislation says, significantly more than 10%. And we're reckoning on, we have to get about 1,500 signatures on a bit of paper. So that's one thing. The other side of it is we've no money. We've no resources. We've got very few people actively supporting. We've probably got 20 to 25 students mostly. Very few people from the local community are actually actively involved in this. I was writing and posting on Facebook quite a lot all through the campaign because we were saying people can't come out because of lockdown. Can't do this because of lockdown. Can't do that because of lockdown. Lockdown finished and nothing changed. Stuff I was putting up on Facebook, I was getting 300-400 likes. But it seems like in this day and age, people pressing the like button on a Facebook post is the extent of their community involvement. I can't change that. But what we can do is keep bashing on, and we're starting a door-knocking campaign to try and get these signatures. We've got no money, so we've got no resources in terms of publications, flyers to put out, and all the rest of it. The other thing I need to say here is, sorry, time? 5 minutes? Okay. I've got a big story to tell and I'll try to condense it. In the course of last year, or this year, I've contacted lots of academics who have got interest in these sort of things. Lots of professionals, architects, planners, etc., etc. And they all think it's a great idea what we're doing. But as soon as I've asked them to actually do something to help us, they all disappear. Right. So, one of the things I'm here today for is to let you know that in terms of occupation, apart from Faz Lane, this is the only one happening in Glasgow. I'm here to ask for support, for you to spread the word, and I don't know how you can help, but what I need, apart from this money, but what I need is for the word to go out, and somewhere there'll be people who can help us. We've got a hardcore of young people, students, etc., but they've got their own commitments, they've got their own studies and all the rest of it to do. At the moment, the occupation consists of people turning up on a Saturday to help dig and do a bit towards the community garden. Other than that, in terms of the land, there's not a lot going on. But there's a lot going on behind the scenes in terms of committee meetings and things to try to plan and find our way through this. The only old heads involved are myself and Nick Jury, who's the local Livy Rent organiser. The rest of it are young, people in their early 20s, students who've got lots of energy and lots of ideas, but they don't have the experience to push this along or the contacts. So what we're looking for is people who maybe were involved in the Govanhill to come and share their experience, to help us with their taking on the council. The council have been totally at arm's length. They obviously want to sell the land. So all we've managed to do is head them off a wee bit, but we haven't actually put a total stop to it. And that will only happen once we get the right to buy. Scottish Government don't want to know. I've tried pleading, asking to go negotiate, I've tried shaming them and all the rest of it. They just keep ignoring us, hope we're going away. But we're not going away. And that's why I'm here today.
Great, cheers. Thanks very much for that, Norman. That was really, really great to hear. And it was great to hear that you've got Glasgow Uni students helping you out, because we're sticking in Red Kelvinside to talk a bit about mine and Alvaro's experience at the Free Hetherington, which was the longest running student occupation in the British Isles. And so I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about the brass tacks of what the fight was and what we did with the building, and then I think Alvaro is going to talk a bit about his experience and kind of the effect of being in occupation and what that was like. So yeah, the context for the occupation was basically it was 2011. the coalition government had just come in for a lot of young people at university. That was the first experience of a Tory government, the first kind of experience of that like sharpening of class warfare that happens when Tories get in power. And more specifically, that coalition government was trying to bring in fees. Obviously, they didn't have the power to bring in fees in Scotland, but the effect was going to be that there would be fees for students from England and Wales at Scottish universities. And the student body in Glasgow was kind of organising to resist that. As well as that, they were trying to take away the educational maintenance allowance, which still exists in Scotland, but in England has gone now, and that was 20 or 30 quid that you got a week for attending school after the age of 16. So those were the kind of key, like, natural things, and obviously broader than that was just the kind of ideology of austerity that was coming in and trying to organise and explain to people that the ideas that it was just that too much money had been spent and there was no money left was not the reality of the financial crisis. The more immediate context was that at Glasgow University there was a new Chancellor, he's still the Chancellor, Anton Muscatelli. And he'd come in, he'd awarded himself a massive pay rise. I think he was on something like 140 grand a year at the time. And he decided he was going to cut nursing, he was going to cut modern languages, he was going to cut continuing education. He was going to cut a lot of the things that still remained at Glasgow and still made it an institution that offered something to the city. That's something obviously that universities have done less and less and less of. So there were redundancies coming in through that, and there was, on top of that, the closure of the Hetherington Research Club. So it's been great to hear kind of about these overlapping stories of occupying factories, occupying places where we live, occupying places for leisure. We had the luck to be occupying a pub, which made things a bit more fun. But yeah, the Research Club was a postgraduate bar and meeting rooms on the campus in a Victorian building that had, I think since the 1910s or 20s, been a kind of meeting place for staff and students to come together and discuss things and drink. And the university decided to remove its grant and to make all of the staff redundant. So we, as a student body, had organised various anti-cuts protests in the run-up to this, and eventually decided that we would launch what we called Operation Chiapas and take over the building. It was really easy to take over the building because the staff had been made redundant, so we simply had to meet with them and get the keys. But obviously nothing starts with that. There'd actually been a kind of period of a year's build-up towards the occupation of kind of building trust in a group. There'd been groups such as Glasgow Against Education Cuts, the National Coalition Against Fees and Cuts, Students Against Cuts, and we kind of met more and more people that were willing to get on board with this till we had a kind of core group that were willing to go into occupation. And we actually occupied a different building first in November the previous year, which I would really recommend if you are planning a long-term occupation, is to have some practice occupations, because that was an absolute shambles. It was basically just one night of fighting with security guards in a building that didn't have any heating, and then leaving the next morning. But yeah, and then the other thing I kind of wanted to mention was that of the students that were involved, most were kind of 17, 18, 19-year-olds, and a lot of them had been involved, had been politicised at times like the Iraq War and the school strikes that were organised. A lot of people involved in this had walked out of school and helped organise that, but they'd also were occupiers that had been as children at the Pollock Free State and had kind of experienced that, had been children at the Govanhill Baths occupation stuff, and so particularly among the Glasgow region occupiers there was a lot of experience of occupation, and a lot of things we've talked about over the last couple of days, and how that kind of, as John Cooper said, if people have the information, if they have the idea that they can do these things, people are quite likely to take the initiative, and the kind of strength of knowing those stories. So yeah, who was in occupation? It was students, it was staff, it was students from across the universities in Glasgow. It was also school kids. I remember someone's mum coming in to tell us that we were radicalising a 15-year-old boy who'd been occupying the building with us, even though he was just reading Mao all the time. But Yeah, and there were other activists, people from that got involved with the G8 stuff that had been not that many years before, people from Pollock Free State, things like that. There were homeless people, there were members of the public, and there were groups of pretty much every political grouping that you'd find. That's another thing that I think's come up a lot over the last couple of days that for me was really powerful about being part of an occupation, was that maybe when you're kind of doing meetings and organising and thinking about theory and stuff, you get boxed into quite a small political faction sometimes, but when you're actually working to maintain a building and to defend something and build something, you inevitably end up working with anarchists and Trotskyists and whoever from whatever organisation. There was even some Lib Dems as part of the occupation. Yeah, no. But yeah, and I'm not saying that I think that left unity is necessarily worth pursuing, but I think that what occupations can help build is a kind of left trust and a kind of knowing that you can work with people across like ideological divides on the left, and I found that powerful. And then the other aspect that was really important was being involved with the Accord Mums. So the Accord Centre in the East End was being closed and demolished to make way for the Commonwealth Games at the time, as was a load of housing where Mrs. Giaconelli ended up as the last holdout, and there was a lot of organising between the Hetherington and people resisting what the Commonwealth Games was doing to that part of the city. And I think at its best, the occupation was able to be a base for kind of meetings and recuperating and coming out to do things in the city. So yeah, those were our demands. It was basically a demand that the club would be reopened, that redundancies would be ended, and kind of broader demands that Glasgow University would become a place of lifelong learning for the residents of Glasgow. So what we got up to mostly was providing free meals, having a free shop, daily meetings, a bar at night, gigs and workshops and lectures. For me personally, it was a really powerful experience of having the likes of Jim Kelman and Tom Leonard and Liz Lockhead come in and talk and engage with the occupation, and kind of having that like living tradition of working class art in the west end of the city coming into the university. On the 22nd of March, the university decided they'd had enough, and they sent Strathclyde police in to get rid of us. And that was kind of the making of the occupation, really. So they came in early in the morning, and they came in way too heavy-handed. I think there were actually only about 6 of us staying the night that night. Unfortunately, we haven't got the YouTube video, but there's a great YouTube video of, it's just called Hetherington Protesters Scuffle with Police. But what it is it's about 10 minutes of police dragging protester after protester out this front door into this crowd. But they haven't secured the back of the building, so everyone just goes around the back, climbs over again, so you see the same people dragged out 3 or 4 times. Yeah, it obviously involved a large amount of the community, a large amount of the student body coming out and seeing how the protesters were being dealt with by the police in cooperation with the university. And I think it's always a radicalising thing to have a scuffle with the police, I think, and I think it did that for a lot of people in the occupation, and it really solidified a feeling among the people that were occupying. They cleared the building eventually, and the student body responded by marching up to the main building and occupying the tower. You can see a very young Dr. Ewan Gibbs in the corner there, who's supposed to be talking here today. But yeah, so we took over the tower and held that for a night, and then in response to that, we also had David Roberts playing on the balcony of the university that night. And in response, the university gave us back the Hetherington Research Room. And I think there's not been many times in my life where I've experienced that kind of immediate win. And another one is obviously Kenmure Street earlier this year. And I think there's something that just can't be underestimated about what it does to a group of people to find that power and to have an institution immediately relent and give you back what you were demanding. So the occupation carried on for another 4 months after that. There were some really great things about that. I think there were some really important connections built and some really important experiences, but inevitably I think the occupation was also an experience of stress and exhaustion and of the pressure of running a building, running a free kitchen, running a bar, trying to keep the space safe. And I think that's another aspect of occupation that I would kind of like to express at this, is that it can often become about maintaining the building, and that is a cost to the movement and a cost to what you're trying to do. And that definitely happened with the Hetherington, but nevertheless there were some great legacies from it. It's the longest student occupation in this country's history. Lots of the people that I still organise with across the city, such as Joey, who was just talking, are people I first met at the Hetherington. Student fees, I think, remain an untouchable issue in Scotland, and I think that's in part due to that student movement in those years. The educational maintenance allowance was maintained in Scotland. Things like the Kelvin Grove riot at the royal wedding, lots of fun events like that. I think we're part of Hetherington, and a lot of people that were then kind of cutting their teeth organisationally in Hetherington went on to put their energies into things like Corbyn Project and the Radical Independence Campaign, kind of for better or worse. So yeah, that's kind of an overview of what the Hetherington was, and my friend Alvaro is now going to talk a bit about his experience there.
So the experience of the Hetherington occupation was life-changing for many people, pretty much, probably all people involved. So things like, for example, the extremely unusual win of getting the Hetherington back when we occupied the tower. Those are things that almost never happen, and when they happen, they are very powerful in showing you what's possible. But small things like running the Hetherington on the day by day, having these daily meetings, sometimes very exhausting, was a very alien but very inspiring experience as well. It will show you that the ideas we had, or at least I had, about these kind of meetings, about running these kind of collective projects, they were all full of prejudice, they were all completely wrong. Because when you see these things working, you see they're full of problems and they're difficult, and they don't happen, without effort. But all the things that you think are going wrong will not necessarily go wrong. And the amount of things you believe are possible grows incredibly. So many of the people who were involved started, we thought it was possible to do things. And for example, I started getting involved in migrant solidarity projects. And I've been running since 2012, more or less, till now, a food distribution project with no budget at all, with completely non-legit, with we were registered as a community interest company for a short time, but most of the time we've been completely informal. But we've managed to keep some of the principles I kind of developed in the Hetherington occupation, like being always having the means reflecting the end, so never using methods that don't reflect what you want to get. So for example, the horizontal way we were running the Hetherington, we were trying very, very hard to avoid hierarchy, to avoid a core group to impose their will on the others. So this kind of practical problems of organization, practical problems of government. I learned a lot in the Hetherington, and I was applying it after in this food project that were involving their users as much as we could, and trying to show them as well that they don't have to be the recipients of charity. They can take things in their own hands and do something collective in a collective way, kind of thinking outside of the box. We are shown that we kind of have to fit in this consume, production, work, etc., sell your labor kind of model. But there were other experiences as well that were life-changing in the Hetherington. One was that it was a hub for lots of very different people to bring their different projects. So Henry mentioned quite a few of the people who came to showcase what they were doing in terms of radical politics at the Hetherington. And then we got involved. That's the way I got involved in the solidarity, in the migrant solidarity projects. But others were also happening at the same time. However, the most, what I remember the most about the Hetherington is the day by day working together, for example, in the kitchen or tidying up or whatever, with someone we have very, very different ideological views on things, and how that became completely irrelevant in most of the cases, and we were very good to work together. We were working together very well. And when time came to the meetings where we have to kind of play our completely different approaches to things, so we really have to discuss something we disagreed on, was in a way quite solved by the fact that there were other points of view as well. And this massive effort we were doing to not impose the views of a minority on a majority, these things would play out in kind of smoothing the conflicts between individuals and make everything kind of a more collective thing. So that was, before I was involved in the Hetherington, I would never think that was possible. Because my experience of radical politics were people being in, like my parents were Maoists, for example, and people kind of having these petty fights on small points of their ideology and kind of sabotaging each other and all these things. But also, the way the university was being, when I came here, I came from a public university where the cultural life was very rich. So you would have your classes, you will go out, you will participate in meetings, you will participate in lots of kind of cultural rebellious activities, and you will stay in the university until it was late at night, and then you will go home. But when I came here to do my PhD at Glasgow Uni, I found that no one was doing that. The university was like a mall. You would go there, you would consume, and you would go back home. And I wasn't sure that it was like, that's what universities were in the first world, or that's what the universities have become. However, during the Free Hetherington, I discovered that that was a model that was being imposed in universities worldwide, in some countries further than others. It was turning the universities into a business, where students became customers, and you will go and pay for a very particular bit of knowledge you were given it, you will take it home when you go. That was all. And Anton Moscatelli, the principal, was particularly transparent example of this kind of brand of managers, senior managers that were parachuted into universities to turn them into businesses. So when we were as the Hetherington occupation, we were negotiating with senior management. It was also very interesting to me to see what their outlook was on things, and how they were pretty much convinced that they were fighting for the well-being of students, but they saw students as customers. And then they would come and say like, oh yes, I've been approached by a student that was very worried about how this was disrupting his educational experience or service, whatever they thought. So that was, negotiating with them gave us a very clear picture of what we were standing against, and made us, I think it was extremely good political education, and pretty much formed a whole generation of people that went on to do other political things. And we acquired kind of priceless education on how things were while we were in the Hetherington. So yeah, I don't know how things were before. I've heard of cases of universities becoming these kind of very vibrant hubs of radical activity, like Paris in 1968, or many other examples, or even what I experienced back in Colombia. But the Hetherington gave us the idea that that could pop up anywhere, because the university was a desert. It was like there was not much to do. I was a senior student doing a PhD. I was kind of old for student ages, and there was not much to do for senior students. Everything was kind of marketed for very young students that would come and have this kind of, what would you call that, MTV show of student life, where you would get drunk and then you would go and consume in the pub, you would go and consume in the classroom, you would go and do this kind of mall lifestyle, and not the kind of organic experience of a university that have happened elsewhere. So to resume, I would say that the experience of the Hetherington was expanding the universe of things we thought were possible, and show us how we can, it took an effort, but how is within our reach to produce things that were very, very different to society as we know it, and in a much better way, in a way we kind of can envision and we can impose collectively, though. Thank you.
Hi, so we're Baile Hoose. There's someone missing today who was really important, which is Sophia, and this was her entire idea, because she's seen a post on Facebook, the injustice of the prices of people charging their flats for Airbnbs during COP26, and she thought that was the exploitation of the working classes in Glasgow, especially during a housing crisis, and then obviously the climate crisis that we're also facing. So the entire idea was to try and help people during COP26. And so we just sort of cooked up this ridiculous plan on the internet, and then it happened. So to begin with, we were just sort of like a ragtaggle team of queers and disabled people, marginalised people, migrants, people of no settled status, because we felt that quite often our marginalised voices were the least heard within these discussions, even though we play a huge part in the class struggle. But even within the class struggle, sometimes we are the more silenced voices, or we don't get a chance to be in these spaces. And so we thought, well, if we're not going to be given these spaces, we'll take the space ourselves and take the space that we want to speak in. So we found a couple of buildings. We cracked one, and it turned out to be a hellhole, not even remotely fit for rats, never mind people. And then we got lucky, and we got the Hamish Centre, which was, we won a watch with that, to be honest. We did not expect, we thought we were going to have to do a lot more work with it when we got it. We couldn't believe that that was sitting there for 3 years empty, while the council just abandoned it, and that in itself is a human rights violation, in my opinion. That could be housing so many people there, and it's imperfectly, it needs work, but it's still a perfectly good building. So yeah, we decided to squat it for COP26. Our original plan was just to squat it for the 2 weeks, and then we figured if we could last a week without the police raiding us, that would be an achievement, and we lasted 5 weeks, which was pretty good. So we had a list of goals that we wanted to achieve in that time, and that was to house and feed as many people as we could. We're all predominantly anarchists, and so we are quite often talking about our principles and our morals and these things, and we need to really start living them more and helping people. And so that's what we've done. We opened the space, we held workshops every day on a whole host of topics. And just said to people, come, if you get arrested and you're packed out, you've got nowhere to go, you need a bed for the night, come rest because recovery and self-care is just as radical as marching on the streets and shouting at politicians. Looking after your comrades is just as radical. Feeding people is just as radical as fighting the police in the street. All these things are just as radical, and we need to start looking after our community and each other. Quite a lot of these photos, we for the first couple of weeks we were quite strict on having no journalists and no photos, and especially no one's faces, because we didn't want to incriminate ourselves. So most of the photos are actually from the last couple of weeks, and at that point we started to let our hair down, and there's quite a lot of silly ones in it. Because we tried to have as much fun as possible, because quite a lot of us have ended up quite burnt out, and it was quite a stressful time. So yeah, we just tried to offer as much support as we could to people, and any sort of help we could give, or direct people to the right services, or make sure people were getting home properly, or they just had people to look out for them, because a lot of people had came from a lot of different places and they didn't know anyone in the city, they didn't know where they could go, they didn't know what their options were, they just turned up hoping that they could be part of something big, and COP26 was pretty big. At one weekend alone we housed over 80 people. So that was a lot of people. We had a couple of people sleeping in cupboards. They were really running out of place. Packed. So we definitely think we had hundreds of people in over that 2 weeks. And then as it got to the 2 weeks, we sort of decided that we'd continue to see how far we could take this. During our time there, we had some visits. Jeremy Corbyn came, so that was a weird one, and we were all a bit confused by it, but he seemed nice enough.
Seemed a bit confused too, frankly. He seemed a bit confused as well.
Yeah, well, half the people in the house fancied him, so that was weird. I've never seen so many crusties and Scotters put makeup on and change their clothes. A lot of councillors, MPs, MSPs, and a lot of supporters online, and people showing up that we just never thought would ever be wanting to be associated with us radicals and anarchists. But it was quite nice actually to hear that we had quite a lot of shared values, and that they realised that we weren't as, I don't know, as crazy in the move what we were, and we're actually just nice people. So yeah, the media side of things, I don't think any of us expected the media presence that we ended up getting. We ended up on so many major TV things, and the news, 6 o'clock news was a weird one, a lot of news articles and things, and we definitely feel that was a huge privilege for us, because quite a lot of other campaigns never really get that media attention or the spotlight on them that can help their campaigns, and we were so thankful for some of it, as much as we have disagreements and had a lot of our own opinions on the media, and specifically individual ones. But it definitely kind of helped in the sense that it made us a bit safer, and I've got a point here about police brutality. From the minute we went there, the police were surveying us. They tried to come in immediately, and until we had some councillors come and say this is actually a civil matter, not a criminal matter, you need to leave these people alone. Had these people not been there, and we did have legal notices put up, which is part of Scotland, even though we technically don't have squatter rights in Scotland, but that's not going to stop us. But yeah, the police were, well, they were the police, weren't they? So they surveyed everyone, followed people at the subways, they followed people at the shop, they would question everyone coming in and out. They were very, very intimidating, even though we had repeatedly told them that there was a lot of vulnerable people within the building. There was a lot of disabled people, there was a lot of queer people and trans people, and their presence alone was actually incredibly distressing to a lot of people. But, you know, the police are never on the right side of history. You know, ACAB. Fuck the lot. But their illegal raid was an interesting one, in that they turned up in the middle of the night, gained illegal access to the building, joining our yard, a square yard, and they tried to force their way through a door and this was the Welsh police and the English police. Police Scotland were there, but they, funnily enough, just wandered away when that was happening, and then claimed to not know anything about it. They then released a statement saying that they were not in that building, they were not in those windows, they were not trying to get through the door, which is interesting because we had filmed them without them realising. As we have some very nice CCTV footage doing everything they said they didn't do, and nice photos of it. So yeah, they're liars as usual, but none of us that are in these campaigns ever expect them to behave in the right way. You know, police brutality is a huge part of the struggle against capitalism. They're certainly no comrades of ours. And then the eviction process as well with Glasgow Council was a whole other issue, in that We were providing what we considered to be a valuable service that the council was not doing, the state was not doing. It was not housing people. We were still having people being directed to the Hamish Allen Centre from the courts and from the council and from the same court that served our eviction. So we were having homeless people turn up to us, say, I'm hungry and don't have a bed for the night. I get told to come here by the authorities. We were housing them, we were feeding them, we were getting them help. Where was the council then? So yeah, the eviction was a bit bittersweet, but I think we proved our point. We were only hoping to be there for 2 weeks to prove a point and to make our message heard, and we think we've done that. But yeah, I think we achieved quite a lot. I think we're still quite proud of ourselves, to be honest, as a group. There was obviously lots of bickerings and a million meetings. But I think we should be quite happy with what we've done, definitely. I'm going to pass you over to Luca to talk about the next step as a group and what's coming after. All right.
Thanks, Violet. This is the hard bit, right? Yeah, so as Violet said, we were only planning to do this for like a fortnight during COP. The thing is that every time we were there, we were kind of expected to be kicked out that night. We just didn't, and didn't. So COP ended, and we were still there. And then, you know, like the court process happened, and the eviction process happened, and eventually we just kind of ended up, winged it, and ended up like leaving the other day. But this is the site, all right? As you can see, actually, can I get on the stage? I might just
squat it.
So yeah, okay. So the front gate is here. There's also a
pointy thing on that.
Yeah.
The top. Yeah.
Oh, look at that! Look at that technology, right? So there's, the front gate is here. There's a side gate over here. The building we were occupying is this one. But there's also like this whole building here. We were occupying a third of this. So we were here. There was a building of equal size there, and then another building over here. So what we were able to do with the space when we housed like hundreds of people was only a fraction of what could be done with this site. So yeah, our next steps are kind of like to reflect on what we were able to achieve, but also to start like thinking about what could be done with this space, because the thing is like, it was all just left, you know, like, and it's such a valuable resource for the city. So yeah, we're having those conversations at the moment, thinking about like maybe forming like a formal kind of body.
Collective.
Yeah, collective. I was like, there's somebody saying something. Yeah, a formal collective, you know, getting a constitution, and yeah, becoming like something that's not just a ragtag group of people, and maybe applying for like a community asset transfer. But yeah, these are not things that we really know how to do, which is why we're really grateful to be here and to speaking with all you guys. But yeah, so this is isn't it beautiful? We've got the whole courtyard. We could do so much with it.
So many vegetables.
Yeah, so many vegetables we could grow. But yeah, this is the new banking district that's coming up. And yeah, there's a worry that like Glasgow City Council particularly wants to like sell this land and make it more banks, because we definitely need more banks. So yeah, what we're hoping to do is to get back in and make it something awesome as soon as we can. Yeah. I don't know if there's anything else I need to add to that. Yeah. Does anybody else want to say something?
Yeah, pass it along. Everyone can say something.
I think a thing that we always sort of spoke about from the beginning as well was how to, because obviously COP was such a, like an outward facing thing, it just landed itself in the city, and about how, as much as this came about because of COP, how it could be like in service to the city and the campaigns that are already existing here out of a need that's existed for a long time and will in the future with housing and emergency accommodation. Yeah, and also the Hamish Allen Centre was a housing shelter for migrants as well. And obviously one of the really bittersweet things which we all really felt was that the people most affected and obviously also most needed housing were just not as able to use the occupation because of the police presence and because of the constant threat of violence. And that's a thing that exists all the time, you know, outside of COP and outside of the occupation situation. So yeah, also sort of trying to think of some sort of safer alternative as well. But yeah, really thinking about how it can be of use to the city. And a big part of the occupation as well was this legal notice that was drafted up. Obviously, you know, down south Scotland is slightly different because the laws, as a legacy, the Highland clearances are slightly different. So you have your section 6s and you stick that on the door and it gives you some sort of protection. So yeah, but it was because the building was public that we were trying to sort of exploit this loophole. You know, it wasn't a commercial building and it wasn't residential, so it sort of fitted into this grey area that we, you know, still there are chats going on about how that could be used in the future and how it could potentially be, you know, forced to bring the public to sort of force strong public access to public buildings as well, you know, with the library closures, all of these type of things. There were really big conversations that were going on. So it's really like how that legal notice and that loophole could potentially be used across the city and other campaigns, as well as what potentially may happen here. But yeah, that's it. That's all I wanted to say. I think. Do you want to
Hiya. So a long time ago I was squatting in London in the 90s and we took buildings, and eventually Camden Council gave up. They were doing the same thing as they were doing here, sending us homeless people whilst evicting us. And we just kept popping up in different buildings until eventually they decided it was much easier to talk with us than evict us. And I think we could do that here, that as a non-incorporated collective, refusing any structure, we can still feed each other and look after each other and have a really nice time. And I've been surprised by the number of young people that have come to me and said, I want to learn this. I want to learn how to build a bender. I want to learn how to do Earth First. I want to learn how to rent my own buildings. And we will send them back right across the country on their free bus passes to go and break their own buildings in their own public areas. And Alan Cartwright, who owns Scotland, there's a lot of public buildings and public land in your area that belongs to you, that you have paid taxes for, that the council wants to sell. And they can't, they should give it to us.
Hiya. Yeah, just to chip in another couple of things that was, it was before I was there actually, but during COP, one of the other things that was that a local charity, I can't remember who, someone probably knows, but they were being approached by delegates to COP from global south countries asking for blankets because it was cold on the streets. Hoose was able to provide a much better environment for those people. And another thing was there was a tweet once which was basically retweeting Hoose tweet saying, "Oh my God, we've been talking to the council for like months and months about providing accommodation for delegates and protesters, and they've just gone and done it." So that was really nice to hear that. Well, it was sad to hear that because obviously people had gone via what upright citizens are meant to do and talk to the council, but actually that had been got nowhere. And a third point I wanted to make was that no one's mentioned yet, but that is that as well as looking after the building, the fabric of the building and the furnishings and all the rest of it, we have managed to make some improvements in the building as well. And it was really important to us that we left it in a really good state. We kept it and left it in a better state than we found it. Another thing was that there was a lot of old clothes and I think there was bedding as well. Yeah, there was a load of bedding, wasn't there, in the building that was really just going mouldy. particularly where there'd been a big leak and so on. Some of the people, like in Hoose, were taking them home and laundering them or taking them to laundrettes, and then in the end we were making use of them, and also at the end we were able to donate them to
Eastwood Refugee Aid.
Eastwood Refugee Aid.
Maslow's.
Maslow's.
Islamic Relief.
To various local charities, yeah.
Yeah, there was any of the bedding and things that had been left by the council, so we managed to salvage a lot of the stuff from the night shelter and stuff so that they weren't left there to continue to rot by the council. So we managed to salvage everything that we could possibly save, and it was donated in bulk to all these different migrant charities and things like. And it was the right thing to do, and we still don't understand why the charities who had left and closed 3 years ago and before the lockdown and the council hadn't done it in the first place. These were donations by the public of shoes, winter jackets, gloves and things that the public had donated thinking they were going to migrants and homeless people, and they had just been bundled into boxes and left. So it was quite good to actually get that moved and given to people who were waiting for it.
Also, you can see, like, this is what we left the building like, you know. This is perfectly functional stuff. There's hot water, it's running, there's electricity. You know, like, the fact that this is abandoned is shocking. But we should probably wrap up, right?
Yeah. We'll just stay there because we're going to have a Q&A. Okay. Yeah? So we'll just invite Alvaro and Henry and Norman.
Yeah, I'm not
Can I take one?
Okay, thank you very much, Baile House, which was a late addition to the schedule. Just like to ask if anybody has any questions for Norman from Still Game in the Valley, for Henry and Alvaro about the Free Hetherington, or for Baile House.
Hi. I'm just really interested to hear, maybe from everybody on this, but what sort of work you did to make sure that the places that you were occupying were safe spaces, like within the community occupying them, because obviously there have been lots of accounts at times from occupations not being particularly safe spaces, particularly for women and trans people. So just be really interested to hear about the kind of processes that you had for making that happen.
Let me answer that. That's a really good question. So predominantly the crack team that took the building were trans and queer people and people of no fixed abode or no settled status in the country. So we tried to make it that everyone who was part of these marginalised groups was the main core of the group, so that was the foundation for starting. We had written up a Safer Spaces agreement that everyone had to agree to when they were coming in, as well as COVID tests, masks, and agreeing to why we were there. Our main sort of Safer Spaces was, just don't be a bigot. Like, there was absolutely, we could not be having, obviously, like sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and these sort of things. And whenever these issues were brought up, and they were, because everyone has different opinions, we tried to discuss it with these people. These issues always come up. I've been living on sites for a long time. I used to live at Fastlane Peace Camp. I've been on squats. I've been on other occupations. I lived at Bilston Glen protest camp as well. But this one so far, by far, was the safest. I lived at a protest site and I was sexually assaulted. I was abused for years. I had a mental breakdown and tried to kill myself. These things are really, really serious, and without that happening, I probably wouldn't be serious about it, but the way I experienced it in other places means that none of that will happen under my watch. I'm never allowing it to happen to anyone else ever again. I don't care if the one person standing up saying that is not happening, I'll stand up and say that's not happening. And all of us sort of tried to live that as well as possible, and we did try to look after each other as well as possible. We didn't always succeed. We did have to ask people to leave. These things happen. Near the end there was definitely a disproportionate amount of men and patriarchy, which is going to have to be resolved in meetings afterwards, because quite a lot of us felt that other people weren't getting their voices heard over sort of white cis male voices, and that's definitely an issue within these things. I think a lot of I think, for me particularly, I think a lot of straight, white, cis men within leftist movements seem to forget the rest of us exist. And you know, the class struggle comes first. Well, it doesn't. We're all together, and all these struggles are important, and we need to make these places as safe as possible, because if you're all eating together, sleeping together, living together, everyone needs to be able to be safe, everyone needs to be looking after each other, looking out for each other. Oh, and we had the Sober Spaces agreement as well, because we also had people in recovery living with us, and we're trying to make that as accessible as possible.
Yeah, just to say that during COP we did that really, really well, and then when COP ended, it kind of disintegrated as a policy. It's definitely something that I want to work harder on. Analysing. Lessons to be learned. And we could probably make it more family friendly as well. Yeah, but it was difficult with the police. So yeah,
that's huge.
Well, one thing I could mention is that one of the subjects that had us meeting after meeting, discussing things for hours and hours, was the safer spaces policy, and the document that resulted from all these days and days and days discussing. I came across after many safer spaces policies documents I've seen after are based on the one that was published by the Hetherington. So I remember that, I think we put it on Facebook or something, and then after that, the Anarchist Federation took that very same document and started working on it. And then after that, lots of other institutions have kind of either copied, paste, made kind of abstract of it because it was very, very long. And it's surprising how much of the discussions that were, at the time they seemed like something very far-fetched and something like, I've never seen something like that happen, but everything had been, I think at this point, everything had been applied, and people have run into examples where some of the things that we were discussing, and it seemed completely useless at the time, these discussions, these hours-long discussions, turned out to be fruitful and turned out to be good because the document that came out of it has been used quite a lot.
Thank you. John, you're going
It's a question for both the groups. Two different questions, sorry. Regarding the still game situation, how can they, do you have a fundraising page? I agree with you, need to start raising money now. And also, will the local councillors any help in the situation? Have they become involved?
One of the big problems we had was until we could actually have a community body, a recognised community body with bits of paper, we couldn't open a bank account. So for official funding, it wasn't available until we could have a bank account. We approached trade unions, etc., and they said, well, what's your bank account? And we didn't have one. So we kept coming up against, that was one of the major obstacles in terms of fundraising. In terms of local councillors, I need to watch my language. Essentially, they were non-existent. To the point, I know the local councillors personally, and I used to think I got on with them, but no, we're not friends at all. And that included the local MSP, just politicians with lots of words, and the rest of them at the council. Our main adversary, if you like, was guy Kenny McLean, who's the SNP councillor, who's the convener of the housing committee, and he was just out and out propaganda against us. In terms of fundraising, the other thing, or in the media, was that we came up against the council's PR department, and basically our PR department was me up against their professional and their access to the media. Given that though, I think I did quite well when we did get a bit of media coverage, but in terms of how they're always asked for their side of it, they had a much more prominent approach sort of thing. So fundraising is an ongoing issue, but we now have a community body, we now have a bank account, I think, and so we're in a position to actually start actively seeking funds.
The other questions for, can I call you the occupiers? I get letters addressed.
The court's dead, so you might as well.
But basically, are you happy to receive any outside help? Yeah. And if so...
Yes, please. We'll put the hat round.
Well, if so, what kind of help would you like? I mean, obviously we can offer financial help.
Okay.
Help me print it, so on, t-shirts, that type.
Yeah, basically at the moment, because we're all living there, a lot of us are kind of still in Glasgow, still drifting. Like, it'd be good to, we kind of need space to work from. We've got a little office space that we can work from. But yeah, there's a lot of, yeah, well, we don't set, we can't set up a bank account. Like, we need to, well, yeah, but we can. Yeah, basically the problem is, like, we've got the same issue. We need to form collective, get a constitution, open a bank account. Once we have a bank account, we do X and Y. But we do have a crowdfunder, but we need to reframe that because we raised $2,000 for legal costs that we then didn't need because we didn't get legal, like, they didn't listen to us. So we just kind of like, we'll have a better answer to that in a couple of weeks, I would say. But you might have a better answer to that, Pigeon, yeah?
You can tell us where the big empty buildings are.
First. No, I just want I think we want help being told by the people of Glasgow, where do you want us to occupy? Because, I mean, we can do that. Like, we've got, like, it's where is the most relevant places for you to be having these sit-ins, whereas the most relevant places to be drumming up this kind of thing, because a lot of us did, like, there's definitely a very strong core group of Glaswegians that set this up, but then a lot of us as well, we did come up for COP and we weren't expecting to stay, but we're having such a great time, and we like it here so much that we're very happy to stay. And so yeah, that's one thing that's been really interesting about this conference, is seeing, like, the lineage of these kind of things, and then also trying to work out where to position ourselves best so that we're, you know, if that makes sense. We're, how do we call it? We've got a Facebook page, we've got an email address, we've got Twitter, yeah. Baile.hoose at protonmail.com.
Yeah, we can write it on like something.
Write on a big bit of paper.
The walls are.
I think I was going to say something really similar, actually. Just ideas and chat and experience and knowing where's best, I think, as well. Because obviously loads of public assets are being sold across the city, huge amounts. Like, what's the numbers? It's 59 community centres and, you know, sporting, you know, all of these really valuable public assets, and there's so much space and room, especially to exploit this legal loophole. But yeah, it's knowing where and
Apparently 50% of people in Glasgow live within 500 metres of a derelict site. So find your own site, find your own groups. Let's get this going.
Maybe ask this question another way.
Yes.
To everybody, all three different groups. Some people say squatting, some people say occupation. And I'm just wondering, like, in terms of like the legal tools that the council was using against like people past, present, and like sort of different sort of organisations of like occupation squatting. Like, what sort of legal tools did the police, the council use against you, and how did you combat that?
Can you just maybe have about 4 minutes?
Okay.
I
I don't really think there's much difference between saying occupiers or occupying and squatters, to be honest. To me, they're one and the same. We squatted a building and I'm quite proud of that. I don't care the connotations that go with that. I'm a dirty squatter and I love it. And I also do occupations, whatever. It's like I think sometimes people are scared of the word anarchist and anarchy as well, and it's fantastic and I love being an anarchist. But in terms of the court, they're just going to refer to us as occupiers, and either way, whatever we call ourselves, we're just always going to be the illegal occupiers, and I don't think that matters much in the case what we call ourselves, but yeah.
In terms of our occupation, like someone's referred about the legal notice, one of the things that I think protected us from the trespass law in Scotland specifically says on private property, because this was a publicly owned building, it counts as public land. So when the police turned up to when they first realised we were there, they were accusing us of maybe housebreaking, but then housebreaking didn't stand up because it didn't look like we were trying to burgle the place. So actually, we've gotten away with our thing with absolutely no arrests, and also, our court case just kind of got dismissed, kind of thing. But also, I want to pick up on something someone else said in a previous talk about how, like, they will just close all the loopholes when they get the chance. So using the law, like, you can kind of use the law as a sort of protection at that point, but it's not sufficient. And as we can tell, like, the laws are not set up to serve people anyway. So I think it's just good to use it as a tool.
Okay, from the Valley's point of view, we didn't break in anywhere as such. There are no buildings, there was no fence around this bit of land. It's been used by the public since 2007 for dog walking and whatever. There's even been a couple of deer on the land. So we aren't seen to be breaking in or breaking any law. The other big thing we've got going for us is that it's a very prominent piece of land, and if there was any action against us, then it would be very, very visible, and it would actually help our cause if they did. The only other thing they could do is spend a lot of money and put a fence around it, which is cost them thousands and thousands. So at the moment, since we've been there, we've never had any interference from the council or the police or anyone else. So it's very much they've been keeping us at arm's length and not adding to our publicity. So that's been good.
Yeah, also, like, we'd have so many discussions, and the initial thing, I mean, court seems like quite a daunting process and something that's negative or something that you don't want, but we'd always sort of we wanted to go through court. And yeah, we just didn't want the police to be involved. It wasn't a criminal matter, it was a civil matter. And yeah, that going through the courts and creating some type of precedent, that was always a really important chat that was had. And I suppose, yeah, if that happens many times over on a bigger stage, I suppose there's more precedent that's able to be set in a legal type of.
Be the thorn in their side.
Yeah,
just keep doing it. Just because if anyone can say something, but
Do you guys
Yeah, I can quickly. We were kind of in a similar situation because it was a university building, it wasn't private and it wasn't fully public, and that kind of acted in our favour because I think both the university and the police were unclear on what their position was, and when the police actually did enter the building, it was found later by an inquiry that that was legal, so that was in our favour. But what they did instead was they tied up occupiers in made-up charges, so I think about 10 or so occupiers were charged with assaulting officers, which is obviously charged with if the policeman hits you. Those cases never came to court, but they tied people up in bail conditions that went on for 12 months and longer. So there were kind of ways that they used to disrupt stuff legally, but I think in a similar way that we just knew less about, there was this kind of grey area, which I think is great to try and open up more in the city.
Okay, we're going to leave it there, yeah, for lunch, but please keep having chats, and I'm sure people are happy to answer questions. Yeah. So thanks so much, Baile, Hoose, Free Hetherington.
everyone, can you please take your seats? There's going to be a performance coming down this aisle. Local theatre maker and performance artist Donna Rutherford has been out videoing and interviewing some of the people involved with this conference. Jim Chestnut from Faz Lane, Jimmy Clockley from the UCS, and others, so you'll see these in her piece. So I'm just going to, if we're all ready.
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on?
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on?
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on?
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on?
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? For me, I think occupation is always about what people need.
The discussion centred on what the targets were going to be. And within that, there was a discussion of, well, why don't we just carry on working? The exact words working were not used at that period. Why don't we just carry on working?
During the sit-in, it wasn't that difficult because there was quite a few people that used Kinnan Park Neighbourhood Centre at that time who had a political background. So technically I was a spokesperson, but at the end of the day there was people who actually knew what we were taking on and what we were doing.
The meeting took place in Bobby Dickie's house with the people that were there, right? Jimmy Early was there, Jimmy Reid, Bobby Dickie, Wee Willie, Jerry Ross and other guys, right? And Sammy Barr, and I forget Sammy.
I have a lot of experience with the army that I realised could transfer into what the peace camp is doing, and the peace camp at the time, that was 85 to 95, was probably the most active that the camp had been. They managed to get thousands of people to come up for demonstrations and a whole range of things.
I've done some non-violent direct actions before, some at Faz Lane, the poll tax, and of course after the poll, or kind of running about the same time, the Not in My Name, the anti-Iraq. But for me, what I liked about the pool occupation, it wasn't about just feet on the streets, there was much more to it than that.
But at that point there was a room in one of the little buildings that we referred to as the office, and it had lots of crusty old pages of lots of material, old peace camp propaganda from the 80s and 90s, and things from old campaigns, lots of leftover flyers. But there was lots of photos and writing of the history, so you know, it's rainy some day and you just like have a rake through some old drawer and find some history. There's loads of stuff in the bus up at the back of the site as well. So you learn a lot from just like pondering over all this material, and a lot from word of mouth.
I felt embraced. I started reading more. I started listening to what was going on at the Bothy, because the Bothy at night time there was great conversations and there was concepts I never knew about. So it kind of intrigued me. So I decided I was going to read those books. What was the most interesting thing for me was the women from the after-school care who had never been involved in politics before, who actually were quite
frightened to begin with. But then as things started to happen, not all of them, some of them still kept to the background, but there was at least 3 women that actually came forward and were absolutely fantastic. They were great speakers, they were passionate, and they didn't take any nonsense. Terrific to actually see people who didn't know that they had a talent for actually fighting for what they needed. And the word is needed, because they needed that after school care.
Social behaviour in animals. Social behaviour consists of a set of interactions among individuals of the same species. A wide range of sociality occurs among animals. Some animals rarely, if ever, interact with one another, even when it comes to issues of parental care. Examples of relatively asocial animals include mosquitoes and polar bears. Highly social organisms live together in large groups and often cooperate to conduct many tasks. Examples of social groups include packs of wolves and schools of fish. The most highly social animals form tightly knit colonies and include all ants and termites, some bees and wasps, and a few other organisms.
They brought in the language of our wee pool, because it was kind of like, yeah, it is our wee pool. No matter where you come from, you were in Govanhill, and it was the Govanhill our wee pool.
There was a communal caravan with a wood-burning stove. It'd been altered just to have seating and you could cook in it, and that's where everybody was.
I mainly just chopped wood and cooked. I wasn't ever up for getting arrested, managed to avoid that ever happening.
All these different folk and different stories. Like these 2 women at Wounded Knee, that was a big Indian thing way back in the 70s where I think it was a massacre, and they went to, I think it was a Sundance, and just explaining that people can actually go and do this and be part of something, and showing a bit of support and kind of solidarity as well. And it just felt, I don't know, this is the place that I should be just now. And I was there for 5 years.
And I think that's what the pool had. It had that hearth. Now, at that time, I didn't know about those concepts. I was pretty kind of naive. But now, looking back, I began to see the importance of that type of protest. It's really about bringing people together.
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on?
We had some very, very, very slightly edited publicly available MOD information from their own website about some military drills they were doing in Gairloch. We printed this off, pretended to be couriers hired by the MOD, and went around the houses in Gairloch Head and Rue on our bikes giving out this MOD information. Eventually the police found out what we were doing, and they were following us around all the houses and telling people, by the way, they're not really from the MOD, they're just hippies from the peace camp. We got chased by the cops, and then we ended up lugging our bikes across the field and taking a back road back to the camp. That was an unusually creative protest action, I think.
Certainly Kinnan Park Complex, in relation to that sit-in, has had a great effect on what happened in the area. We set up what was called the Arts and Regeneration scenario, and what we were saying is we want the arts to actually have an impact in the Greater Govan area. Now, it did. When we started the arts in Govan at first, and sorry for laughing, but this is the truth, and I might have to swear on this one, but you can always edit it out if you don't like it. When we spoke to some of the councillors, to saying, you know, we're going to be doing this, we're going to be doing that, and we're going to bring the arts together, you know, out in the street, being as creative as possible. Don't fucking bring your trendy ideas for the West End out here then, because we're not going to fucking have it. Well, 30 years later, actually, the arts has made quite an impact in Govan, and it's bringing money into Govan that it wouldn't have been getting if we hadn't actually started that. Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Which side are you on?
Which side
are you on?
Group living is widespread in the animal kingdom. Although many species form temporary associations, such as flamingo colonies and zebra herds, some species, such as African elephants, snapping shrimp, and superb starlings, form more permanent social groups and live together year-round. Organisms are inherently competitive, yet cooperation is widespread. Genes cooperate in genomes, cells operate in tissues, and individuals cooperate in societies. Animal societies in which collective action emerges from cooperation among individuals represent extreme social complexity. Such societies are not only common in insects, mammals and birds, but exist even in simple species like amoebas.
One of the tricks, of many tricks that the government and shipbuilders tried, was the fact that they declared the company was going into liquidation when the government were on holiday, the John Brown's people were still working. So it was a divide tactic. It was only half of the group there. And myself and pal of mine, Davy Torrance, we were in the south of France camping with our wives. We wanted to go home for the campaign because we'd heard about it on the radio in France. But the lassies wouldn't let us. Women's power took over and we finished the holiday. It wouldn't have made much difference anyway. However, the meeting took place in Bobby Dickie's house with the people that were there.
Ask yourself, why did Thatcher close Molesworth Peace Camp, Greenham Common? All the other peace camps were closed down, and some of them quite viciously, yet Faslane wasn't. Why was that left? Different people have different answers. And some of the things that the camp have done, you know, when they get inside a Claris submarine, inside the control tower, I've seen letters that Thatcher had written and she was furious, but still, the peace camp stayed. You're not doing anything important if you didn't have people bugging you. That way you know you're doing something important.
They decided they would shut down the neighbourhood centre. Now what happened in the neighbourhood centre was a lots of sports, but the main thing was after school care for children. It was run by a voluntary management committee. And they were panicking about this, and we decided that we would actually have a sit-in. The majority of the folks said, you can't, what's a sit-in? And the reality is, because we had the big sit-in in Govan, in the shipyards, I was able to say, well, you remember how it happened with the shipyards, with the sit-in in there, well, why can't we have one here and fight for our community centre? It was a 55-day sit-in. They did everything they could to try and stop us from doing it. They turned off the electricity, they turned off the heating, but actually we had some really smart people that were in the badminton club who were quite political and also engineers and electricians. So they were able to help us. We also got a phone put in the kitchen so that if anything started to happen, we would just phone the tree, you know, the sort of contact tree, and people would come. They tried to get us out 3 times. But every time we were able to convince the police that we knew what we were doing, and technically community education had one worker who was left in there himself all the time, and we would say to the police, listen, we have to be honest with you, we're actually protecting this young man that's been left in here himself, and we actually are safeguarding him from, if he's getting broken, who's going to defend him? The police say, aye, okay, and they would leave. Okay, so after 55 days, they gave us the right to have the community centre.
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Come all you good workers, good news to you.
Whether it's squats or sites, my advice to anyone getting involved is don't neglect your mental health. If you've got a mate's house or your parents or a relative that you can go and visit and stay for a couple of nights every once in a while, go and do it. You don't need to give it absolutely everything because you'll just get burnt out. And there's a lot of mental health issues in a subculture. You can see it everywhere because people don't have a private space to retreat to. I suppose that's why I stopped it all, is because I did it way too hard without that concern for myself.
Which side are you on?
Many social behaviours of animals are adaptive, meaning that being social ultimately increases an animal's reproductive success. One example of how social behaviour is adaptive is aggregation against predators. This concept applies to caterpillars feeding together on a leaf, a herd of wildebeest, schools of fish and flocks of birds. A landscape filled with solitary wildebeest will offer easy pickings for large predators such as lions. If the wildebeest gather into a single group, then the risk of any single individual being eaten is reduced. In the circumstance of an attack by a predator, the odds of one individual being targeted are 100% for solitary individuals, 1% in a group of 100, and 0.1% in a group of 1,000.
Trust. Highly emotive word, very difficult to find in so many occasions.
My comrades of the pool occupation, we had to trust each other and look after each other's back, and we did that, and everyone who was part of that occupation is still my buddies to this day.
The UCS campaigners had it in abundance from the population and internationally. They trusted their leaders and they knew they were dealing with the real deal.
There's got to be trust, especially when you're working in some protest movement that's getting a lot of publicity because there's a lot of people are listening to the phones and you're bugged and there's spies, and you've just got to trust the people running about you.
When we were in the sit-in, there was no doubt that the people who were committed to it, they had your back all the time. We had people like Jim Kelman who would come down and really, really work hard and ensure that you got support mechanisms. We had people coming down from Easter House, it was doing the same thing. We had folk that would be people shot through the windows for us, you know, so there was kindness. And so you could trust people to come and help you out with that.
Side are you on? Which side are you on?
There was a lot of trust attached to relying on them turning up for every shift. without any compensation being available to them. So in that sense, the trust of people dedicating themselves to actually turning up for whatever was required was really, really good.
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boys?
Belief, and my beliefs are beliefs in society, humanity, that's my beliefs. My belief is not based on some amorphous statement, it's based on reality, what's tangible, what makes sense, what's cogent, understandable.
I believe that people, given the opportunity, could find in themselves something they never knew existed. But because of the sort of structure of our societies, an awful lot of people never get the opportunity to even look into themselves because they're actually struggling to survive, both from maybe a mental health point of view or a physical point of view, or being made to feel that they're not worthy of anything, you know. So it's about trying to do things that's about showing them that they can believe in themselves, and that through that belief they can challenge other people's opinion of who they think they are. But it's really difficult sometimes to give people the confidence to do that.
The belief that things will get better, that there is a step now of people coming together. I know it seems that no, nothing will change, but I don't believe that. I see a flickering of lights, and I have great belief in that. The power of people who's had enough.
Altruism. The benefits of social life typically occur when one individual is the benefactor of an act of altruism. An altruistic act is one that increases the welfare of another individual at an actual or potential cost of the individual who performs the act. An example of altruism comes from ground squirrels, who may warn other members of their group about a predatory hawk overhead. This brings the hawk's attention to the individual giving the warning call. This risky behaviour benefits other individuals in the squirrel's group. Living in groups involves a balance of conflict and cooperation, which is mediated by the costs and benefits associated with living socially. When the benefits of living socially exceed the costs and risks of social life, scientists predict that social cooperation will be favoured.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
It's changed a lot over the years. I mean, the camp's older than me.
I think the momentum that was there in the late 80s, early 90s is waned a wee bit.
Nuclear disarmament is, as a movement, has diminished hugely from its peak, which I think was in the 80s, and I feel like if it was ever going to work, it was going to be then.
My main focus, and I can't get away from it, is the water now. Watch and record nearly every sub that goes in and out. At the end of the peninsula there's a tower that lights up when a vessel that's got difficulty manoeuvring, so everybody else keep clearing it. It usually just means a submarine. And where I live, I can actually see it. I can just open my front window and take photographs for there. And I do that, I can't get away from it. And still monitor convoys.
Lindsay and Martin has actually taken that building to a place where it now belongs to the community. Now it's been shut for nearly 2 years now. It's going to be hard and it's going to be changed. But the young people who are now running the building is really fantastic.
it sounded a lot less at the fringes of society than it is now and has been recently. I don't think everyone was an anarchist back then, whereas pretty much that's the deal now.
All we can do is just inform people, let them know that things are still happening. You know, these subs are still here.
There's a group of people working on local place plan, and they've called their organisation Because We Say So. And I love that expression. And I love that expression because they're saying for the first time, I don't care if you're a politician, I don't care if you're a bureaucrat, this is what we want and it's because we say so. I think that's a great way to look forward.
Hi everyone. Hello, hello, hello. The next part was meant to be a presentation from Paul Bristow from Magic Torch Comics. One of the things that we're really happy about with this conference and really thankful to our funders, the Foyle Foundation and the Baile Norman Melbourne Trust, is that all of these occupations will feature in a graphic novel by Magic Torch Comics. They were doing a 4-page one for Govanhill Baths anyway as part of a social justice graphic novel that they're doing with Caledonian Uni. But every occupation here will be featured in a graphic novel that's going to be published next year. Unfortunately, Paul couldn't be here today. He's from Port Glasgow, Greenock area, and we were really glad to be working with them because, you know, they all grew up with the Lee Jean story. So he's recorded something for us, so just let you hear that.
Hello Govanhill, I hope you've had an excellent few days sharing stories of occupation and taking back control. I'm Paul Bristow from Magic Torch Comics and we work with schools, community groups and all sorts of people to tell stories using comics. I was supposed to be joining you all today to tell you about a project we're working on just now. Instead, I'm at home waiting on a PCR test result. But Paul has kindly fixed it so I can at least briefly say hello and share a little about what we're up to. The Magic Torch Comics grew of a project which was about exploring and retelling the story of my home in Inverclyde, which, you know, often finds itself at the top of the same sort of lists as Govanhill in terms of health, poverty, deprivation and so on. And so we set about retelling the story of our hometown, from re-magicking the landscape with folk and fairy tales, to exploring the darker history of our celebrated local industries, and examining the lives of soldiers sent off to war. Now we work across the country creating all sorts of comics, from stories created with school classes to encourage literacy, through to stories of women's experiences of the asylum process in Glasgow. We still tell historical stories as well. We recently worked on Paisley Radicals, retelling a wee section of the story of the radical uprising in 1820. Many of these you can read and download online for free. I'll share some links at the end. And it's worth pointing out that I do the writing and the community delivery for our project. So all that amazing artwork that you've seen is done by a huge range of artists all across the country. Comics are a team game, that's one of the things I like about it. So at the moment I'm working with Glasgow Caledonian University on a Heritage Lottery funded project called Common Good Comics. And this project is putting together 2 different comics. The first one, which is finished, explores the history of social enterprise in Scotland, using the stories of half a dozen social enterprises who developed mostly during the 1980s and onwards. Then it will be released early next year. The second one celebrates all sorts of community action and community groups. And by good fortune, Paula had got in touch with me about the Govanhill Baths occupation, which I was of course familiar with, and the Occupy project in particular, and it just seemed like an ideal fit. So the plan was to create your Govanhill comic for the Common Good Comics project, and then also use it in a comic adaptation retelling all the stories from the conference you've just been attending over the last few days. More about that in a moment. I worked with Paula and lots of Govanhill veterans to explore the story of the history and occupation in their works, which is always the key for me in any of the comics that we do. I'm helping other people share their stories. I worked that into what was going to be a 4-page script, but ended up being 5, and I think, to be honest, we'll probably add one more. Govanhill should feel quite chuffed about that. I've managed to condense most stories down to 4, but this story just was not having it. And of course there's this wonderful, amazing community archive of photos and footage for Govanhill, which we're able to tap into a source for the artist, which is ideal. I just love that. The plan was to have a 4-page comic all printed to share with you today. However, the best laid schemes of mice and men gang after glaze, I'm sure you know, so instead what I'm sharing with you is the briefest glimpse really of the opening page, which introduces the history of the building. I'll just let the art do the talking for a minute. The rest of it's all been tidied up just now, and there's a few things I want us to tweak and add before we share. For example, I'm trying to convince Ray McKinley to do a page for me, and I'm sure we'll get there. The next step though, is all the stories that have been told and shared over the last few days, they will be getting the comic streaming too. So shortly, I'll be getting a chance to listen back to your presentations and discussions, and working with a team of artists to adapt those into the Occupy comic, which will be launched in spring next year. And hopefully you'll all be along at the launch and I'll finally get a chance to chat and meet with you in person. As well as physical copies of that book, it will be hosted and made available online, promoted as a social history resource in schools. It's, getting these important moments out there and understood by as many people as possible, inspiring them not to always just accept what's given and to understand the power that we have. Meantime, if you want to get in touch about your group's story, you can contact me at any of the details here, and you can read many of the comics that I've shared today on our website and issue page at these links. So thanks for letting me explain a bit more of what we're up to, and enjoy the rest of your day.
invite up Catherine Midgley, who's the Heritage Outreach Learning Officer with Govanhill Baths Community Trust, and Lottie Blades Barrett, who is the manager of Rags to Riches. They're going to tell you about, Catherine's going to tell you about what's happening with the refurbishment, and then Lottie will tell you a bit more about what's happening with Rags to Riches.
Hi everyone, thanks for sticking with us till the end, and thanks so much to Paula for inviting me to speak. My name is Catherine and I run the learning programme at Govanhill Baths. So you heard yesterday from Danny Alderslow and Gina Dare and others about the campaign to save the baths from closure and how we got to where we are today. And I'm here to tell you where we're up to, basically, give you some updates. I've actually got some pictures which no one's seen yet of the inside of the baths from last month to show you. So, but before that, just a little bit about my role. So the learning programme at the baths is directly linked to the refurbishment. It's funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, so thanks for the money. It's great. And the aims of the project are to really make sure that everyone in the local community feels involved with what's going on at the baths, because of course we wouldn't be refurbishing it if it wasn't for the local people. So that's really a summary of the main aims of the project. So it's creating a plan of activities for when the building reopens, to develop relationships with local people so that we're sharing their stories in material that we're making, and so that the activities we deliver are the ones that people actually want. To give people opportunities to learn about the history of the baths, and most importantly to get people excited about the building and what they can find there when it reopens. So I don't know how much you know about the refurbishment of the baths. Some of you probably know a fair bit, some of you not at all. All of the facilities that are going to be in the new building have been chosen by the community themselves, and that's through a series of community consultations which took place over several years. You can see a couple of sort of architects' stock photo type images at the side here, just to give you some idea of what it's going to look like. The inside of the baths has 3 pools, 2 of which will reopen in this phase of the refurbishment. There'll also be a gym and a yoga and a dance studio. They're up where the slipper baths used to be, but we are keeping a couple of the slipper bath cubicles as well, so you'll still be able to have a bath at the baths if you want. There'll be a Turkish suite with a sauna, steam room, massage tables, all those fun things, a community kitchen and cafe, a permanent home for our People's Pantry, which is currently on Cathcart Road. It's a membership-based food pantry and a way to combat food waste and food poverty in Govanhill. So that's going to have a permanent home in the new building. Home for our archive, which is very exciting. It's never had a permanent home before. We'll be able to welcome people in to do research and things like that and have exhibitions. An event space, bookable space for people to use how they want, and really importantly, the whole building will be fully accessible, so we'll have a changing places toilet, ramps, lifts. We're going to have sensory backpacks for neurodiverse folk, material in community languages, so we really hope that everyone in the local area will feel at home in the building. So next up are some pictures of where we're up to, hopefully. Thanks very much to Becky Duncan for these. This is the main pool. That's not going to change that much in this phase of the refurbishment, but like the whole of the building, it's going to be made wind and watertight, and any repairs will be made, and we'll continue to use that as an event space until further funding is sought. The next pictures might be a bit shocking if you know and love the building, because there's some quite heavy-duty works going on there right now. So this, for example, is the steamy, and that is going to be a multi-purpose arts and event space, and that's also where the pantry is going to live.
And the archive?
And the archive, yeah. But, you can't really see that one so clearly. I don't know if anyone at the back wants to put a couple of lights, but if you can see that, you can see that part of the roof has gone, and that's because there's going to be a new floor added to one part of the building, which is going to act as a bridge between the front and the back of the building, and that's going to be this really nice, quiet, bright space, maybe even with some plants in there. This is where the Turkish used to be, and I think it was also where Rags to Riches studio was after the trust took over the building. And we're getting a Turkish suite back, which is really exciting. This one looks very grim. This is the slipper baths. The cubicle walls have been removed. It does look a bit like a hospital or something worse. And weirdly, all the baths were concreted to the floor, so Clark's, the contractors, had a real job getting them out there. One half is going to be the gym that you saw in the previous picture, and then the other half will be a yoga and dance studio with a couple of the cubicles retained, and it will look a lot nicer. And here is the basement, which I think will have some bookable spaces in it here. But at the moment, the whole floor has been removed, and there's rubble coming through there from the roof and so on. So it's quite inaccessible at the moment. So that's where the building is up to. So what have I been doing? Well, as you can imagine, everyone's really keen to get into the building, but with COVID and with the heavy-duty refurbishment works that are going on just now, it's not really that possible. But we were able to welcome 70 people to the building for Doors Open Days. That was the maximum we could accommodate. They actually booked up within about 10 minutes of the website going live, so that was a really big success. We have an ongoing series of talks and workshops, book launches like the wonderful 99 Calder Street by Bristow, which we have at the back there. School workshops. The lower picture here is from a recent workshop which I led with GBCT Ceramics at Holy Cross Primary. We were talking about the tiles in the baths and tile making in the local area, and then each pupil made a COP26 inspired tile which is going to go in their playground. Importantly, we're working with the contractor Clark's to hopefully welcome some local students for apprenticeships, both trade-based and office-based, and that will be an amazing way for young people to gain some employment skills. And Clark's, the contractor, they really like to work with people over a long period of time, so if you get an apprenticeship with Clark's, they'll really try and offer you a permanent position afterwards, so that's really, really exciting. And within Archives and Heritage, we currently have a number of students on placement from both college and university, learning about all aspects of heritage work. And just to say, with all of these projects, our aim is so that local people really feel that the Reopen Baths is going to be a resource for everyone. If you're, for example, a teenager and you just want somewhere to hang out with your pals, you don't want to have to spend money, and it's too cold outside, then there's going to be space in the front suite of the baths with some nice couches, you can come hang out. If you're elderly and you want to exercise and meet some new people, we'll have some gentle exercise programs for you. If you want segregated swimming, if you're a Muslim woman, for example, or LGBT community, then we'll have segregated swimming events. So we're really trying to think of the building as a resource for everyone in the local community to feel at home in. Finally, just to say how you can get involved. So we have a really exciting project which is launching next week called Sponsor a Tile. That's being led by our ceramics workshop. The idea is for a donation of £25, you can have your name or a name of someone of your choosing engraved on a tile, which will go be part of a mural in the front suite of the baths forevermore. So watch this space. We'll put up details on our website and our mailing list, social media and things like that, and it should be from next week. You should be able to take part in that. Check our website and social media for latest events, but we also have these leaflets at the back. We have an event coming up next Friday at the Point, just along the street there. It's No Radio Silence, which is with GBCT community project in association with Unity Sisters. I've made a short film about women's experiences of the asylum system. I think it's going to be a really great event, and there's more details on these flyers which we have on the table at the back. So I think that's everything. Let's see. Yes, that is everything. Thanks for listening. I'll pass over to Lottie, who'll tell you more about the UpHub and our wonderful upcycling work.
Hi everyone, I'm Lottie. I am the project manager for Rags to Riches and the AppApp, and we're based at the Deep End. Rags to Riches is an award-winning social enterprise, and we specialise in using the circular economy and waste to promote environmental sustainability, community engagement and education within Glasgow and the surrounding areas. We provide workshops and community outreach within our own venues, but we also provide community outreach with third parties. and we like to support and empower local groups and vulnerable communities. We also sell a range of upcycled products, which you can find on our website, on the Govanhill Baths website, and on the online shop. And it's about creating economic opportunities for local makers, and we're actively trying to reduce waste. So everything on our shop is 100% zero waste. So Rags to Riches is an umbrella project for the Up Hub, which is a Climate Challenge Fund project. So the Up Hub is a circular, again, very similar to Rags to Riches, a circular environmental project. It's funded by the Climate Challenge Fund, which is funded by the Scottish Government, and we work within our local community to share how valuable waste can be, and that can be anything from doing, again, community outreach work, products, workshops and things like that. And we specialise in waste wood, textiles and plastics. And we, as I said, we also do events and make playgrounds as well. So this is who we are. We're a team of 5. I'm a project manager. We have Kenny, who is the facilities manager, Alexandra, who looks after all of our community work, Gail, who's our textiles facilitator, and Delphine, who looks after plastics. And we, like I said, we're based at the Deep End, and we currently work from 3 workshops, and they include our woodwork space, which is a really fantastic space where we do all of our workshops. We do some of our community outreach, and we also do our product making. There's loads of equipment there and loads of waste materials, so anything from saws to drills to all sorts of hand tools. There's just plenty to kind of get involved with. This is our plastic. This is kind of 1/3 of our plastics room. So this is where we recycle all of our plastics. We have several machines, including what you can see there, which is the plastic recycling machine. We also have an extruder, and we have an injection mould. And as you can see on the right-hand side, this is kind of all of our recycled plastics that we've gathered up over the last few years. And then we have our textile space. So this is where we host workshops and also make a lot of our products. As you can see, all of the waste textiles down the right-hand side, everything is donated to us either by private donors or by companies, and then we also have sewing machines and cutting space and lots of haberdashery. So, to talk a little bit more about the work we do, these are some examples of some of the upcycled collections that we do, so some of the upcycled products. So as you can see, we have waste wood, we have plastic and jesmonite there, and we also have textiles. You can kind of see the chopping board is made from scaffold wood. We have a whiskey barrel candle holder, and then as you like the colourful kind of tray at the top, that's made from eco resin, but it's also made from waste jesmonite generated by our workshops. So that's a really like zero waste way of looking at kind of developing products. Over the course of 2021, we've sold roughly about 300 upcycled products and materials, so that also includes recycled plastics. And we've worked with 10 independent and in-house makers and making cooperatives, including our lovely team at the Up Hub. And this is kind of a little screenshot of our online shop, which you can find on the website. So we, as well as our product range, we do fee-paying workshops. So these are kind of, we host these in the evening, and they range from upholstery workshops, macrame, jesmonite casting, sewing for beginners, and woodworking for beginners. And again, everything used in the workshops, well, the majority of things used in the workshops is waste, and it's about upskilling and getting people together, especially after the pandemic. And we host all of that at the Deep End. And then we do community outreach. So we've been working with lots of different organisations across the south side of Glasgow to deliver a range of community outreach projects. We worked with around 20 community groups, engaged about 250 participants, more than 15 volunteers and more than 10 facilitators. And yeah, as I said, it targets groups such as like youth groups, schools, and includes a range of craft packs that we actually delivered over over lockdowns from COVID-19, where we sent out craft packs and people did them at home and then shared the lovely photos of everything, and we delivered Zoom workshops. And so I thought I'd give you some examples of some of the outreach work we've done. So this is a photograph, a couple of photographs from St Albert's Primary School. I'll go into that project a little bit more in depth in a second, where we worked with children and parents and the school to deliver workshops and refurbish their local playground. This is the photographs from YCSA where we delivered craft packs, and this is one participant who took part and they did basic woodworking skills and things like that. And then during kind of the breaks from the lockdown, we hosted a couple of workshops, and this one was with Wesbrook, and this is upholstery and woodwork. So it just gives you a bit of an idea of all the different things that we kind of get up to. And then outside of that, and the final aspect of what we do is community builds. So we've worked with the Wellbeing Group, People's Pantry, again the Deep End, Gammis and St Albert's Primary School over the last year or so to make beautiful things for our local community. So you can see here really lovely planters that have really brightened up the area. And then for what I mentioned before, St Albert's Primary School, we did a full playground refurbishment using majority waste materials. So we used 756 kilos of waste wood, and we engaged about 43 parents and children across 3 hands-on upcycling workshops where we made bug hotels, bird boxes and biodegradable bunting so that they could get involved with the refurbishment of their playgrounds. So we worked in 3 different spaces for them, so that's one of them. The one on the top left is our quiet zone. It's like an outdoor learning zone, and then on the right hand side we have a reading zone, and then 2 other photos of the obstacle course that we did. So and again, that's all made, about 90% of it was waste materials. So we couldn't do any of this work without waste, as I've mentioned. Over the summer, the Outcome and Ranks the Riches have collected nearly 2.4 tonnes of waste from our local community, and this includes over 300 kilos of plastic, over a tonne of wood, and over 600 kilos of textiles. So what we collect wood-wise is green wood from tree surgeons to chipboard and hardwood. So we work with private donations, so if you have wood lying around at home, then we'd be happy to take it. But we also work with a lot of businesses and organisations, so kitchen fitters and builders and construction. The textiles that we've collected, again, private donors, but we also work with Marks and Spencer's on a yearly basis where they give us their old promotional banners from the shop, and we turn them into all sorts of fun things. A lot of the plastics that we collect range from children's toys that are garden furniture as well, right through to bottle tops, to Tupperware, to all sorts of things, and we recycle that all internally at the Up Pub. And then twice a month from May this year, we started hosting markets. So we have the Big Zero Waste Market, which is 100% second-hand or zero waste, and it's about celebrating second-hand and bringing it all together. And then we also have the Craft Market, which is about celebrating local makers. And so what's next for us? So this is really exciting. I don't know if you know what we're looking at, but very exciting for us as a project. And we're looking at, in the new year, we'll be launching our first fully circular plastic product, which is, what you're looking at here is an injection mould with recycled plastics injected into it to make carabiners. So the joy of these carabiners is they are classified as PP, which is number 5 on the classification, which means we give them to people, and then if they ever break, they can return them to us, we recycle them, and they can be remade into carabiners once again. So this will be something we'll be looking at in the new year. And we'll be continuing our work with schools and the local area. And we'll be also establishing a core range of upcycled products to be sold across Glasgow to kind of raise awareness of the work we do and the wider organisation of Govanhill Baths. And if you're free, we've planned all of our workshops up until March next year, so if you fancy learning something new, we have plenty going on, and we're always at the deep end. And again, as I mentioned, plastic, we're going to be extending our plastic supply chain and looking at how we can engage more businesses and organisations in the conversation about moving to zero waste. Thank you.
Very much, Lottie and Catherine. So it's been a bit of a marathon. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming through. I'm just going to finish up. I really want to thank Fatima and the people who did the lunch on both days. Wonderful. To Stevie West, who's helped set up, who's not here, but to Jen and Chris on the video cameras, and Martina, who's been taking some still photography. So my big passion is independent community archives, and that's how I got involved with Govanhill Baths. Doing these kind of heritage projects, we've done a number of projects, but it was really important at the 20th anniversary to celebrate the occupation. And once we started thinking about it, we thought, oh, wait a minute, there's other anniversaries out there. And once you kind of just dug deep a little bit, scraped the surface, all this other information came up, and I got in touch with people like Andy Clark, who spoke earlier on Lovable jeans, Lovable Lee jeans and Plessey's. So I think what Andy said was really important, that if we don't remember these stories, if we don't know our own history, then it's forgotten. And it's really important to know what our own history is. Caterpillar have a legacy group. Govanhill Baths has its own archive that was set up by the people in the occupation. They knew, they collected the material because they knew they were making history, and if they didn't look after it and keep it, then it would be forgotten. Timex has a history group. Vaseline Peace Camp have their collection at Spirit of Revolt Archives of Dissent, which is based at the Mitchell Library. I'm also the project archivist for that archive. They also have Simon Newell, which has material about Pollock Free State, and these wonderful the Brian Hartley collection, which is a daily diary of Pollock Free State in charcoal drawing. John Cooper, who was here earlier, his full collection is at Spirit of Revolt. The Glasgow Housing Struggles Archive that Joey Simon spoke about. So yeah, it's just really important that we keep the conversation going. So please get in touch. I don't know if anybody else has got anything else they want to say at the end of the day.
I don't need the microphone. I just want to say thanks very much to you, Paul, for organising this.
Thanks to Donna for a great performance. Is that us? Sorry? Is that us? Yeah.